right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. Today I've got a very special treat for you. It's the debate of the century on the Shroud of Turin with my debate partner, the atheist YouTuber and PhD, James Fodor. And basically, we were on Tavo San Abri's channel debating the proposition: are the shroud images and their formation best explained via a divine miracle or a divine design by God, or was it best explained by a medieval human artist? And on this front, I think we had a great debate. Tavo was an excellent moderator, very accommodating and stuff like that, in terms of my rebuttal going a little bit over time and yet fair, giving James, making sure James had an equal amount of time. And yeah, I think it went really well. James did a great job giving his case and what he thinks are most important for establishing his case and that sort of thing. And I think it went very good. So, with that said, I do want to do a bit of a post debate review, at least on James's rebuttal specifically, because I'm very interested in my James and the skeptics' take on my religion authenticating miracle identification criteria. This is something that I spent years on developing as a non believer, 2015, that sort of thing. And I was coming up with these set of criteria for judging miracles. And my overall argument, judging the religions, how can we judge miracles as proof for a given religion and put that together as positive evidence and contrast that with any negative evidences against the various world religions to decide which one, if any, is the one endorsed by God, either as true or as the religion he wants us to follow for the time being to achieve our ultimate purpose in creation. Out of respect to James, and give sort of my counter on some of the objections he raised in the debate to these criteria in general, because I think it's important. And I think he kind of misunderstood some things. Not his fault. He only had one day to go over these. But I think it's respectful for me to go over what James had to say in his rebuttal, because I didn't get to respond to all of it or as thoroughly as I wanted to. That said, there have also been various feedback from other skeptics and questions in the live chat from friendly, smart skeptics like Kevin Nontradicath. There was a comment by the ultimate Shroud Skeptic, Hugh Farey, that I want to get to. And there was some other skeptics that I'm less impressed with. I want to respond to a few of them as well. But for this episode, I want to respond again in the Mike Lacona standard and focus in on James and his rebuttal in particular, and just give my reaction to that after the debate. So with that said, before I get into my post-debate comments, let's see the debate in its entirety for itself.
All right, and we are now live. Well, great to be here. Welcome, everybody. A happy Friday morning to all of you. I'm really glad that you checked out my channel, and I'm especially glad that you checked out this video. This is going to be a really great discussion. I'm very lucky to be joined by two of the most thoughtful and most compelling interlocutors on their respective sides that I've interacted with on YouTube. So really great content creators. I'll do a quick introduction and then we'll get to their opening statements. We're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin today. I'm pretty agnostic on this topic, so I'm looking to be persuaded one way or the other. James Fodor is a really accomplished cognitive neuroscientist, PhD, great thinker, incredible channel, great content, has a great website that goes through a lot of things about a lot of different sciences. So I'm really glad that Dr. Fodor is here with all of us. And Dale of the channel Real Seekers is one of the most long-running content creators on the topic of the Shroud of Turin, has a really great channel called Real Seekers, has a Real Seekers ministry, works as a guest speaker, does a lot of engagement on very high levels with people on the apologetical side and also on the atheist side. So I'm really glad to be joined by both of these individuals, and I think this is going to be a really great discussion from both of them. So we have time statements, but I would encourage the audience to put your questions in the chat section, and we'll get you some questions later on, and most of this is going to be time statements. So I won't be talking for most of the video. But again, I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I'm really glad to be joined by two great thinkers, and I'll let them do quick introductions of themselves before we get to their prepared opening statements. Let's we started with Dr. Fodor first, so let's start with Dale of Real Seekers. Dale, what would you like to tell the audience about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Dale. I'm the host of Real Seekers, and basically, yeah, I specialize in topics on the philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics, and yeah, cover everything from the existence of God to the Shroud of Turin or the historical evidence for the resurrection and that sort of thing. So yeah, the Shroud of Turin is sort of a specialization of mine. So I'm really delighted to debate this topic with someone who's probably one of the best. James, you've put the fear of God into the Shroud world behind the scenes. They consider you a formidable debater on this topic. So yeah, I'm looking forward to doing the discussion. And happy birthday to Faith from Facts. I hope we put on a good show for you.
Great. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thanks very much, Tavo, for having me, and Dale for your kind words as well. So, yeah, I am. My name is James Fodor. I am from Australia originally, currently working in the US at Carnegie Mellon University. I am a cognitive neuroscientist by day, and I guess in my free time, I like to engage in counter-apologetics responses on my channel, James Fodor on YouTube, where I talk about some of the scientific, historical, philosophical aspects of mostly Christianity, sometimes other religions as well. And I defend a broadly naturalistic worldview. And yeah, great to be here, and hope we have a good discussion.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be a really great discussion. All right, well, Dale is going to go first with the affirmative case in regards to the authenticity of the shroud. Dale, do you I don't have, I've got your screen, but I don't have I've got James's slides. I don't have your slides yet up, but you can share your screen. Oh, there we go. Okay, now they're showing up.
Yeah, hopefully. I think this is easy. For some reason, it just wasn't loading, so I'll just share it traditionally. Is that
okay? Yeah, no, that's great for me. I'm gonna go ahead and mute myself, and I'll start the timer at 20 minutes for your first statement.
Okay.
And whenever you're ready, go ahead and start.
Okay, so today's debate topic, as I understood it, is debating: are the shroud images best explained through God, a miraculous explanation, or through a human artist? I'm going to be claiming that I think God or divine design is the better explanation, and James will be arguing that a medieval human artist is the better explanation. So, in order to meet my burden of proof, I see it that I have two fundamental aspects I need to establish in my opening. Number one, what is a set of criteria by which we can identify and which are rationally justified to infer divine design or a miracle as the best explanation for a given event in general? And secondly, that in the case of the formation of the Shroud of Turin's images, they fulfill these criteria. Okay, so presuming God existed and did want to miraculously authenticate a given religion, I think I would argue that God, as a real maximally great being, could not place any undue epistemic barriers or undue religious confusion on the majority of humanity. And because of this, when he's providing miraculous proof, there's a standard of proof that he gives. And I don't think it's only, he provides miracles only for the super intelligent genius, someone who has a PhD in quantum physics or statistics. No, it's aimed at the everyday average man. In other words, the civil law definition of the reasonable person. And I think if even one reasonable person could be convinced that it's a miracle, rationally believe that it is a miracle, then it must be a legitimate miracle. They must be rationally justified and and warranted in that sense. Otherwise, God would be guilty of creating undue religious confusion. So that's the standard for my religion authenticating miracle criteria by which we identify such. So what are the criteria? So first of all, criterion one, obviously we have to prove that some kind of event took place. Otherwise, there's nothing to explain. I don't think that will be controversial. Criterion two is that the event takes place within a specified religion authenticating context. So there has to be an attached context which serves to authenticate a specific religion, either its essential doctrines or its uniquely demarcating aspects. And further, that event can't be subsumable to any other religion. So, an example of subsumability, take the virgin birth. Well, Christians claim that, and Muslims claim that. Who gets that? Who, does that miracle? If we could prove the virgin birth, who gets that? And I have a certain criteria, but essentially I say that the first religion chronologically to claim a ram is who the reasonable person would assume the ram is meant to serve, unless a later religion can fulfill certain requirements. And I don't think we need to get into that because it's not applicable to the shroud, so far as I know. Criterion 3 is that the event is extraordinary, or another word, complex. And this can be established, first of all, by proving that the event itself is unique to extraordinary context. It's outside the reasonably well-known or well-established naturalistic mechanisms. And secondly, there's this extraordinariness person. A reasonable person would think that this event is extraordinary and that ordinary natural mechanisms are improbable or impossible. And I give 3 ways to do that, to prove that. So number 1, a reasonable person can conclude that all the currently well-known or well-established natural mechanisms are improbable to be true. Number 2, a reasonable person could conclude that the event is unique to extraordinary contexts, despite a sufficient opportunity for duplication in an ordinary natural context. And finally, 3, a reasonable person can conclude based on extraordinary circumstances, such as the providential timing of an event or something like that. Now, interestingly enough, what's the rational justification? Why would I say that a reasonable person is justified in inferring a miracle on the basis of these criteria? And I just want to state, in terms of the shroud in particular, it's interesting because both James and I would agree the shroud images must have been formed by intelligent design. This isn't just due to random chance processes or natural mechanisms alone. There had to be a designer with intelligence. We just disagree on who that designer was. Is it God or a medieval human artist? So in terms of looking at this, I look to intelligent design theory to rationally justify my RAM identifying criteria. So I think that basically Bill Dembski's specified complexity provides this underlying justification. So intelligent design when the event is sufficiently attached to a religion authenticating context, that serves as the specification criterion. It's an independent pattern that's independently derivable from the event itself's occurrence, right? And I'll go over how that applies to the shroud later on. In terms of extraordinariness, I think this roughly corresponds to the complexity criterion. And basically that just says, the event is improbable to occur relative to the various alternative natural explanations. Now, with my application of specified complexity, I'm obviously using, my standard is the reasonable person. So I'm not getting into the technicalities of Bill Dembski, where he talks about, you have to be a statistician and be able to calculate all the probabilistic resources properly and compare that to a probability bound. I think here the probability bound for the reasonable person is the 50%. If something's improbable to be explained naturally, that's sufficient for the reasonable person to go, this is complex. This event is probably extraordinary. But it's these intelligent design criteria, the complexity of the event plus an independent specification where it conforms to this independent pattern. That's what fulfills this actualization, elimination, specification triad. Fancy words, it just means, look, you're making a choice, intelligent choice, and for a specified goal, right? And you're eliminating other possibilities and you're actualizing one thing to bring about a specified goal or purpose. Picture a rat in a maze, right? They actualize taking certain paths once they learn how to get to the cheese. They eliminate the other false paths they could take, and it's for the specified purpose of getting that end goal of the cheese and fulfilling the maze. So that would be an instance of intelligent design on a rat's part. Okay, So that's sort of the underlying theory, the general criteria. How does this apply to the Shroud of Turin? Well, first of all, in terms of establishing criterion one, the shroud images obviously exist, and they have certain physical and chemical properties, what I call the minimal relevant features. So, for example, it's the shroud exhibits some photonegative or a semi-negative image, whereas the bloodstains are photopositive. The shroud stains contain topographical, otherwise known as three-dimensional or depth information, encoded into the lights and darknesses of the images. The shroud images are uniformly colored, and this is approximately 98%. There's a plus or minus 2% there in the peer-reviewed literature, but other than that, the straw yellow coloring of the shroud is uniformly colored on each individual fiber. And okay, so and then the other feature is that there's this vertical mapping process, right? So that there aren't lateral distortions or significant lateral distortions. It's mostly follow whatever caused the images, the mechanism traveled in a vertical path from the body to the cloth, presumably. And, you know, same with the dorsal image from the body down to the underlying cloth. Fifthly, the body images are superficial, and this is on three levels. The fabric level, so it doesn't show up on the back of the cloth. The thread level, top 2 to 4 in the peer-reviewed literature, it goes to 4 in some papers. Top fibers of each thread. And on the fiber level, it's only 0.2 micrometers on the primary cell wall of each individual fiber, which has a diameter smaller than that of a human hair. The shrouded body images contain some highly anatomically accurate depictions, which are remarkable for the medieval ages. And it also contains some apparent inaccuracies, which we'll get to as well. And then finally, there seems to be a lack of evident body images underneath the bloodstains, and there are off-image bloodstains as well. So these are some of the features, just some of the hundreds of MRFs that need to be explained. And here's an illustration of the vertically mapped. The shroud vertically collimation process was the path P kind of thing, straight up from the tip of the nose up to the cloth. Okay, now, is the Shroud of Turin's images and their formation, is there a specification there? Does it conform to a religion authenticating context? And I think in this case, both James and I would agree, absolutely it does, right? First of all, there is an independent pattern from the Christian Gospels alone of Jesus's passion, which includes very specific sequence of wounds where he's getting scourged, then he gets crown of thorns, then he's crucified, then he gets stabbed in the chest with a spear. There are very specific pattern to Jesus' death and his subsequent resurrection narratives. And these are independent. Whether we ever had shroud images or not, we would be able to derive this pattern of this remarkable death and resurrection serving as a religion authenticating miracle to authenticate the truth of Jesus's message, aka Christianity. So that's totally independent. And the Shroud of Turin does conform to that. The Shroud of Turin's body and bloodstain images clearly attest to a man who had been scourged, received a crown of thorns, died due to the crucifixion, and was stabbed in the chest. James is probably not going to disagree with this. In fact, he would, yeah. So, and then finally, there's the implication of the resurrection, which is the miracle part here, because again, the body is clearly dead. It's in a state of rigor mortis. And yet the body somehow was removed from the shroud within a few days, before sufficient decomposition liquids could build up, and was removed in such a way, leaving behind unexplainable images. That can imply Jesus' miraculous resurrection. So I do think it conforms to this independent given pattern. Okay. Now, one thing with this is that the specification criterion is sufficiently fulfilled just by a religion authenticating context. I don't need to establish a chronological connection with the historical Jesus to make this argument work. It doesn't matter. Let's pretend the shroud is a medieval object for the sake of argument. On the basis of the scientific evidence related to the images and their formation and this independent religion authenticating context, that's sufficient for the reasonable person to say, yes, God designed these images. Now, here's an example to illustrate why I don't think the dating matters and or other errors, certain historical inaccuracies that skeptics raise, or even anatomical inaccuracies I think could be argued to be irrelevant. And here's an example. These are photos of Lego Jesus representing his crucifixion and his resurrection from the dead. Now, clearly it has a date, 2011. These photos were made, and these are regular photos created in naturalistic ways, and there's nothing special or remarkable about them. Now we can imagine James prays to God and says, God, I'm an atheist. If you exist, please give me proof that Christianity is true and give me a miracle to authenticate Jesus' death and resurrection, and I will become a Christian. And all of a sudden, zap, poof, God turns these images into images with miraculous properties. Perhaps they start talking to James saying, yes, I'm authenticating that the crucifixion took place. It's true. I did die and rise from the dead. Become a Christian, James, or something like that. Now, are you really going to go, yeah, but this isn't the real resurrection that happened in 30 AD. This images came into existence in 2011. So therefore I'm going to deny the miracle. Or are you really going to go, well, look at this Jesus here. He's anatomically inaccurate. The historical Jesus never really looked like this. Or there are certain historical inaccuracies here. So I'm just going to dismiss the absolute proof for a supernatural miracle authenticating Christianity in front of me because of these side issues. No, I think James would rightly say, no, if God did that, that's sufficient for a miracle. I don't care when these photos date from. I don't care if there are historical or anatomical inaccuracies in them. Talking photos is proving Jesus' death and resurrection is good enough. So that's just in a nutshell my argument. Criterion 3, are the shroud images extraordinary or complex? Well, in the first place, nobody denies the shroud images are indeed unique, and that they do, as we saw with the specification, they do take place in an extraordinary context. In other words, a religion authenticating context, which qualifies as such. In terms of extraordinariness, with the first way, we can create a mechanistic type argument. This is how most pro-shroud people argue, and they say that any and all naturalistic mechanisms, and we'll specify for this debate artistic mechanisms, because that's what James is specifying, none of the artistic mechanisms are able to explain. And here's just a summary of all the main categories or umbrella categories of artistic theories that have been proposed. They all fail in one way or another to explain all of the shroud's minimal relevant features. And you can see the totals here for all the artistics. It ranges from 5 to a score out of 8 out of 17 possible points. It's only a supernatural miracle explanation that fulfills all 17 here. So we can clearly say, yeah, the artistic mechanisms are improbable to be true. And James highlights a specific, the frottage, Luigi Gardaschelli one. So we'll go over that in more detail in my rebuttal as to why that fails in particular. And then finally, look, in terms of artistic, just to summarize what we find, I'm going to quote the non-religious agnostic Dr. Thomas de Westlow. And you can see here's the Shroud of Turin compared to a comparable Shroud of Bisankon, which is very clearly an artistic painting, nothing special to it. It's night and day comparison here. But here's from the non-religious agnostic Dr. Thomas de Westlow, a medieval and Renaissance art historian and expert, who even he says, quote unquote, as an art historian, I study imagery from the 13th and 14th centuries, like the picture you see on the far right. Now, if the shroud is a medieval image dating from around this period, art historians like me ought to be able to look at it, study it, and tell you who formed it, how was it formed, where was it formed, and so on. But we can't with the Shroud of Turin. You didn't need to forge the perfect forgery like the Shroud of Turin in the Middle Ages. People were gullible in those days, especially when it came to religious relics. In short, the idea that the shroud is a medieval work of art is simply untenable. It doesn't look like a medieval work of art, it's not made like one, and it's certainly not conceived like one. And that's why art historians like me have completely ignored the shroud over the course of the last century. It simply doesn't fit into the history of art. So yeah, these artistic mechanisms fail. But there's also a second way with the shroud images and their formation, based on its uniqueness. But remember, uniqueness alone, there's a lot of unique things out there. Its uniqueness despite a sufficient opportunity for duplication in an ordinary natural context. And the shroud has had ample opportunities. There are both natural or historical opportunities and artificial opportunities. So, for example, how many burial people have been buried in burial shrouds over the centuries, and that sort of thing. And the only thing we have is the Shroud of Turin with images on it. No other burial shroud or linen cloths from antiquity that covered bodies or anything like that. None of them have images comparable to the shroud and their associated MRFs. Furthermore, if it's an artistic object, there's been lots of artistic opportunities. Over the centuries, there have been tons of artists who could have come up with wouldn't we have at least one comparable shroud image created artistically? Maybe not exactly like the shroud images, but with enough similar remarkable properties to go, okay, this is tenable that it was created as an artistic relic or fake or anything. But here's the real kicker. When it comes to artificial opportunities, this is where it's game over. There have been dozens upon dozens of artificial attempts to try and reproduce the shroud, knowing the MRFs, and with 20th and 21st century knowledge, doing everything they can to reproduce the shroud in various field and lab experiments. And to date, every single one of them has failed. That's a sufficient opportunity for duplication in and of itself. And all have failed. The artistic techniques don't work. And again, in my rebuttal, I'll cover James's favorite one, Luigi Garlascelli's technique, and show you specifically why that fails. Okay, so in conclusion,
1 minute remaining.
All right, so yeah, the perfect timing. So the shroud images MRFs do indeed fulfill the RAM ID criteria, and I believe the RAM ID criteria could be sufficient for at least one reasonable person to rationally conclude the shroud images qualify as a RAM. Therefore, God is a real maximum great being who cannot allow even one reasonable person to experience undue confusion. Therefore, God, I can be warranted in believing, yes, this is actually true. I actually have knowledge that Christianity is true, because otherwise I would be experiencing undue confusion. And that's impossible with God as a real maximally great being. You could not allow for that. Basically, it's on this front that I make my case. So thank you very much.
All right, that was a really great opening statement, Dale. I'll turn it over to James. And don't forget, I will be putting in the discussion and the description of the video links to Dale's long-running Shroud series and his channel, and I'll make sure all those links are up there. Don't forget to ask your questions in the chat, because I'm highlighting the questions, and we'll get to a Q&A section, and we'll get to that shortly. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to James, who's also a really great content creator, another great person that I admire. Really glad that James is here. So we'll turn it over to James, and we'll start the clock here at 20 minutes again. So let me make sure your slides are up. Okay, great. Go ahead, James.
Muted. Great. Thanks very much for having me. And thanks, Dale, for your opening remarks. So obviously, I'm going to be presenting the skeptical account of the Shroud, and particularly, I'm going to be attempting to answer these 4 questions here. So in my view, an adequate theory of the Shroud needs to be able to provide at least plausible answers to these questions. So what are the characteristics of the Shroud? And sort of why does it have those characteristics? How old is the Shroud? So when does it originate from? By what processes could the image have been formed? And why was the Shroud made? So these are the what, when, how, and the why. And I'm going to be attempting to answer these questions from a naturalistic point of view. And then in my rebuttal, I'll speak to how well I think Dale's account does at answering these questions. So let's start with the what. Let's look at the nature of the Shroud image. So Dale's already mentioned some of these features, so I may go over them a little quicker. But one of the things we notice from looking at the Shroud is that the height of the body is quite unexpected relative to what historically would be expected for a first century Judea. Remember that the Shroud of Turin purports to be the burial shroud of Jesus. That's what it obviously, on inspection and from the context, is appears to be, and everyone has always understood it to depict this. So that's the comparison I'm making as to how these features fit within that expectation. So the whole shroud is 4.4 meters long. It wraps on the front and the back of the body. So based on this, we can make a rough estimate here that the image of the height of the person is about 1.9 meters. Another way that you can make this approximation is that the body is about 8 heads tall, which is higher than the 7.5 average for adult men. There may be some amount of distortion here due to stretching over time, but even so, this is a very implausible height for the time of first century Judea, where a 1.7 meter height would be much more expected. Some other characteristics that are relevant here. Now, unfortunately, the slide has covered up. Sorry, I might actually present separately here because I think it's going to distort some of my slides here. Sorry, let me just, if I can share from my computer, because I don't want it covering things.
That's okay. I'm pausing your time just to, because I do see what you're talking about. So
is that, can we, no, hang on.
Yeah, I can add you to the stage. Let me see if I do this, I think this gets added to this. Let me remove this actually, and then we go like this.
Yeah, where are we? Sorry, let me just jump forward. Okay, are we seeing that? Sorry, I can't see.
Yeah, we are seeing that.
All right, cool. Yeah.
Can you see the screen on StreamYard? Just so you can see that it's
Yep. Okay, looks good. Sorry about that. Yes, don't want my text to be obscured. So regarding the proportions of the body, so these also don't really match those of an adult human male. The left arm is about 7 to 10 centimeters longer than the right one, as are the corresponding fingers. And so you can see an illustration of this here with an overlaid a depiction of illustrating how the left arm is substantially longer and the longer fingers are displayed there. So this indicates that either the image was not actually formed by being overlaid, the cloth overlaid on a body, or possibly that there were later touch-ups to this image. The fact here that the hands are shown overlaid on the groin is quite significant. And this fits with the next aspect that I'm going to discuss, which is the posture of the body. And in particular, the positioning of the arms is not just unnatural for a corpse, which is generally laid flat, but also it's not actually anatomically possible for a normal adult human to place their arms so as to cover their genitals in this way. If you don't believe me, try to do it yourself. It doesn't work. If you lie flat with the elbows bent to this angle, you simply cannot cover your groin like this without hunching over. And indeed, we see this impossibility with in reconstruction, such as from this Italian exposition, which shows what the body of Jesus may have looked like. And in order to get the posture to work, for Jesus to be actually, the hands to be covering the groin, they have to hunch the head and the shoulders forward here and have the knees significantly up, which is an extremely unnatural posture for a corpse. And it also doesn't really match what's shown on the shroud. Again, that body does not seem, to my sight, to match what is shown in this posture here. But as we can see from like a modern depiction of a Jewish burial, that just isn't how you prepare or place or wrap a corpse. So it's a very unnatural position for the body and a very unnatural shape, relative proportions. But in fact, we can explain why the image is like this, because the style of the image that we see on the shroud is quite common in Gothic art and sculpture around the time. Conventions do vary slightly depending on the exact time and place, but I've put up a few quotes here that speak to this point. So this particular study by Hufschmid actually talks about the body proportions in sculpture and painting in the medieval period, and they talk about how exaggerated length of forearms is a very common feature in this style. There's a similar quote here from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which talks about both paintings as well as sculptures in the late medieval period, and how many of them follow this highly stylistic form with the elongated features and a sort of a stiff form. Looking more specifically at images of crucifixions, you see again the emaciated and elongated limbs. And also another key element here is the depiction of Jesus being shown in a loincloth. Now that is not historically accurate. Crucified victims who were crucified naked. It was part of the shame of the punishment. But in the early medieval period, this became common as a way of in medieval depictions as a way of covering Jesus's genitals. And it's fairly clear that this also explains why the shroud was depicted with Jesus covering his genitals there. It follows the custom at the time of covering Jesus's genitals. Obviously, a loincloth would be even less plausible in the burial context case. So they placed Jesus' arms covering his groin here, even though that's not actually anatomically possible and doesn't fit with the position the body would have been in. But as I'm arguing here, the shape of the body, the proportions of the limbs, and the covering of the groin all fits with common artistic depictions in the late medieval period. Now, one final point that I just wanted to mention briefly that's sometimes brought up is that the shroud departs from medieval customs in placing the nail holes in the wrists, which is where the Romans would have actually hammered the nail. It supports the body better, rather than the palms, which is where almost all of the medieval depictions show them placed, as you can see, for example, in this image here. So shroud proponents, Dale hasn't mentioned this, but I just wanted to bring it up because it is fairly common in shroud proponent literature to discuss this. But I think on a closer look of the actual image, it doesn't actually support this view. So you can see a close-up of the shroud itself here with some anatomical overlays for comparison. The wrist is visible here as at the angle where the bend of the hand joins the rest of the arm, and this here, where you can see my cursor, that is the palm. You can clearly see that the nail hole is covering the palm, not the wrist. The carpal bones, excuse me, of the wrist are lower here. And remembering that originally the image would have been the image was produced as a depicting of Jesus with his arms above him outstretched on the cross. So the nail would have been in the palm there, and the image there is showing the blood dripping down below, which then covers the carpal bones of the wrist. But the center of the mass of the blood is actually below where the hole would have been, which is in the palm. So that's just a minor point about that particular issue. But overall, what we see when we look at the shroud is a series of artistic conventions which are not anatomically plausible or historically accurate in the context of a first century crucifixion, but which do fit well with a late medieval artistic conventions. Now let's move on to dating the shroud. When did it originate from? Let's start with the historical record. So around the mid-14th century in the village of Liry, north-central France, a large fabric that bore the image of Jesus began to be put on display. Where's the image that I had of it? Yeah, so you can see an image here of some sort of like souvenir artifact which dates to this time and clearly depicts the shroud or an artifact much like it at least. And so in terms of written sources, the first written sources that we have date to just slightly after this time, so late 14th century. The Bishop of Troyes, who had jurisdiction over the church where the shroud was displayed, he wrote a memorandum to the anti-Pope Clement VII at the time, and in that he declared that the shroud was a forgery and that his predecessor had identified the artist who made it. Separately, we also have another bishop who, in a separate document, also denounced the shroud as a forgery around the same time, late 14th century. So the two oldest written references we have to the shroud, bearing in mind which date 1400 years after the shroud's alleged origins as the burial shroud of Christ, both describe it as a human artifact and a forgery. Later, the shroud was gifted to the House of Savoy, and then it was moved to the cathedral at Turin, where it has remained ever since and given rise to the name. So because there were obviously a lot of interest in the shroud and questions about its origins, the Vatican finally, in 1988, allowed the shroud to be carbon dated. They selected a region in the bottom left of the shroud. You can see here, they cut off 3 strips, each of which was sent to a different lab named after its location, so Zurich, Oxford, and Arizona. And the dating was performed independently in each of those 3 labs. Each performed an extensive, though subtly different, as we'll see later, chemical cleaning process to remove any impurities or contaminations to date the linen that the cloth was made from. Here are the uncalibrated results here in years before present, radiocarbon years before present, so ranging from about 650 to 750. And when calibrated, that corresponds to a 95% confidence interval of 1260 to 1390 AD. Now, one thing that we should also be aware of is that these same labs at the same time dated 3 other artifacts of known historical provenance: an Egyptian mummy, linen from a medieval tomb, and then threads from a cloak in France. And we see that these carbon dates also mostly overlap with the known provenances of those objects. One thing to note about the shroud dates is, as though that they cluster in the late medieval period, there is a bit of a discrepancy between the labs. You can see here that their own confidence intervals are a bit discrepant. And this has attracted some discussion. Some people have, again, Dale hasn't commented on this, but I think it's worth mentioning. Some have claimed that their dating to the late medieval period was a result of contamination or dirt, which skewed the dating. But this is really a very implausible explanation, and it's not widely accepted. The extensive cleaning protocols would have removed this, or would have removed almost all of the contamination. There was no visual signs of this, either when the shroud was initially inspected and the cloth components removed, or when the labs performed the dating process. And the amount of contaminant that you would need to skew the dates from a 14th century to a 1st century date would have meant that about 2/3 of the entire mass of the material would have had to have been contaminant. And it's just incredibly implausible that would not have been either detected or removed. And my own preferred explanation for the discrepancy of the dates between the labs is due to somewhat different cleaning procedures, which are discussed in this paper here if people are interested. In particular, the Oxford lab used petroleum ether as part of its pre-cleaning procedure, whereas the other labs apparently did not. And this paper finds that even modest difference in the pre-cleaning procedures can account for removal of a slightly additional removal of contamination and dirt that had been built up over the years, accounting for a slightly older date. So to summarize the results from the historical analysis, we see textual evidence as well as radiocarbon dating evidence that the shroud dates from roughly the 14th century, which is precisely when it first appears in the historical literature, so that radiocarbon dates and the historical dates match up perfectly, and those are 2 completely independent sources. They also match up with the with the artistic conventions that are displayed in the shroud that I talked about before. Now let's move on to the third component, the how. How was the image formed on the shroud? Now, I'll just talk briefly about the nature of the image. Dale has already mentioned a few of these points, so I'll go through it a bit briefly. The shroud is made of linen. Linen consists of woven threads, which are made of flax fibers from the flax plant, and each fiber in turn is made up of cellulose microfibrils, which comprise the cell wall. So there's a diagram showing these microfibrils here, which are overlaid in this sort of lattice framework comprising the cell wall of the plant, and a bunch of these together form a flax fiber, which then are bound together to form the threads. The image of the shroud itself is a faint and superficial yellow discoloration of the top few 2, 3, or 4 linen fibers of the cloth. And this in turn is a result of graded oxidative damage of the cellulose. When cellulose experiences oxidative damage, it becomes yellowed, as you can see in this diagram here. And it's gradations in that degree of oxidative damage which account for the physical basis of what the image is. Now, an important aspect of the projection of the image, because the image on the shroud is apparently that of a body, but the shroud image doesn't match that would be produced by direct contact of a cloth with a body that's laid underneath it. This has been demonstrated numerous times. The images I'm showing on the left are from Gala Shelley here, on the right from actually a digital reconstruction that looks at the same point. There's distortions that are implicit in the act of placing a flat object on a curved surface, particularly around the head, which doesn't produce an image at all when placed in this way. And I think that this is actually a critical aspect, which hopefully we'll discuss later. The shroud obviously purports to be a burial cloth of Jesus, but it's not possible for an image to be formed in this way as a burial cloth. The image could have been formed in different ways. Obviously, it was formed in some way, but placing a cloth on a body does not form an image like this. And so there's something inherently deceptive about the image that's shown on the shroud. It doesn't match what it purports to be. Now, bearing in mind this projection issue, as well as the superficial characteristics of the image through discolored linen fibers, Luigi Gallascelli, professor of organic chemistry, made a reproduction of the shroud in 2009 using only medieval technologies. He placed a linen sheet over a volunteer, rubbed the sheet with acidic pigment, which caused that superficial oxidative damage in the regions that made contact with the pigment in the body. He then augmented this with a plaster bas relief of the face, because as shown, you cannot get a face image just by placing it over a body. So the face was done separately. And then he placed the shroud in an oven to artificially age it, and afterwards washed off the pigment. And so the result here is shown as a close-up image. So on the left is the Gallashelli shroud, and on the right, an image of the actual shroud. Not the precise same magnification, I couldn't find one, but it shows that both illustrate the superficial yellow discoloration of the fibers. And on the right here, you can see the positive and negative images of the face part of Gallashelli's reproduction. So Dale has made a point of discussing, and I'm sure he will in his rebuttal, some of the differences between Gallashelli's reproduction and the actual shroud. We'll discuss these further, but note that my claim here is not that Gallashelli made a precise, microscopically identical reproduction of the shroud. That's, as I'll discuss later, an entirely unrealistic requirement. What Gallashelli showed is that this general method of using a bas-relief face combined with a body, washing it with, rubbing it with acidic pigment, and then aging it artificially can produce a shroud that has the general characteristics of the actual shroud. In particular, an image formed using gradated oxidative damage to the superficial linen fibers. And so I think this provides a plausible mechanism for the formation of the shroud image. Note that Dale himself did not provide any explanation for the nature of the shroud image. So to conclude, I just want to talk about motivation. So why was this image made, and what are the different explanations that can be provided for this? Now, the context in which the shroud arose is that of medieval iconography. I looked up how to pronounce this word and I've forgotten, but this word describes icons that are thought to have come into existence miraculously, not created by a human. And this was actually quite an important concept in the Middle Ages. The Fourth Lateran Council actually warned against people being deceived by fake relics, which was a huge industry in the Middle Ages. And I'm just showing here some examples of shrouds, as well as some other relevant iconography, like pieces of the True Cross, which existed during the Middle Ages. The dates here are, as far as I could find, the first historical reference to that corresponding artifact. So the point here is that the shroud originates in a context in which iconography was incredibly important, and many, many people were producing different artifacts of different forms that related to the crucifixion of Jesus. So the two hypotheses about the origin of the shroud is that it may have been an intentional forgery, which corresponds to the earliest written accounts that we have, or it may have actually been a devotional icon, so an image that depicts something but is not intended to be an authentic artifact. And as an example of this, Dale actually mentioned this, the Shroud of Besanon, which is a copy of the Turin shroud. What Dale showed and what I'm showing here is not actually a photograph of the Shroud of Besanon, which doesn't exist anymore. It's actually a photograph of a drawing of the shroud. So we don't actually know what it looked like. This is just a drawing depiction of it. But the point I'm making here is that, and I've put an account on the left here, many people came to see this shroud throughout the 16th through the 18th centuries, even though it was known to be a copy of the shroud in Turin, well, France, and then moved to Turin. So the point here is just that just because an artifact resembles something that has devotional religious significance doesn't mean that its creator intended it to be an authentic artifact. It may have originally been intended as a devotional icon, and then later people came to the belief that it was in fact Jesus's real burial cloth. We don't have that information. I lean towards the intentional forgery hypothesis,
1 minute remaining,
because of the historical accounts which tell us that contemporaries at the time believed that this was the origin of the shroud. But I'm just mentioning here that there are two hypotheses here, that it was either intended as a forgery to earn money for the churches that it was displayed in, which is what our earliest accounts show, or that it was created out of devotional context. Now, either of these accounts explain why someone would create this object. And I think by contrast, it's incredibly unclear why God would produce this object through a miracle. But I'll discuss that further in my rebuttal. So I'll conclude here, and we'll pass back to Dale for his rebuttal.
Well, those were great presentations by both of you. I really appreciate that. There's great comments in the chat, and keep in mind as you all are going through the chat and putting in your comments, what I'm doing is I'm starring the relevant comments that I think are really great questions, and I'll bring those up to our speakers before the end of the. Let me dismiss that timer. That was the timer of your end going off. Sorry about that. But don't forget that you can put your comments in the chat and ask questions to both of the speakers, or either or. And I've starred all your comments so that we can go back through those. Now, what we're going to do is 10-minute rebuttals from each side. And James or Dale, anything you want to say specifically first, like any thoughts before we go to the rebuttal section? If not, we can just go straight into it. Okay, great. I'll turn it back over to Dale then for the rebuttal. And what I'll do is I'll bring Dale up as Dale, do you want to share your screen or anything during the rebuttal?
Yeah, sure. I'm just wondering which. Okay, just let me know when it's good to go.
Yeah, you're ready to go now. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So, first thing I want to address that James brought up, and he's absolutely correct about, is that I didn't offer a specific image forming hypothesis. And in all fairness, I think everybody knows from my channel that I go for a theory called the vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis by Bob Rucker. Now, James has actually debated Bob Rucker himself, who's a nuclear engineer, on my channel about that. So I didn't want to repeat history. So for this, I purposefully am not specifying. I'm just proving it is it's provably divine design. God designed these images miraculously or supernaturally, and that's sufficient. Perhaps it's what philosophers of action call a basic action. And God spoke, and poof, the shroud was there. So it doesn't matter about the specifics. I'm keeping it vague on purpose. But getting into a specific rebuttal, so I noticed, look, I can accept, for the purposes in this debate, I could wholly accept half of James's presentation, and I would still say it's irrelevant. A lot of it due to do with dating or certain anatomical inaccuracies as he sees it and that sort of thing. And okay, fine, I could grant those. And remember, I've argued those are totally irrelevant to deciding whether the shroud images are miraculous or not. It's up to James to establish the significance of these findings. How does this falsify that it's a miracle? God can't do a miracle in the medieval period? Of course he can. So, but that said, I'm going to be charitable and go through them as much as I can anyways. So I'm going to split it up into relevant and irrelevant objections. So the first relevant objection related to image formation is he brings up Luigi Garlascelli's 2009 hypothesis. And this, unfortunately, this hypothesis, even Luigi Garlascelli himself has admitted, and even James, I think, is admitting in this presentation, his images don't do the trick. They don't reproduce all of the shroud's minimal relevant features. And let me explain why. That's not just something to go, well, it's close enough. No, it's game over. If you fail to fulfill or reproduce even one minimal relevant feature, then that's an inherent failure to the process. But let me just go through some of the problems. So James likes plausibility, explanatory scope, and explanatory power criteria to judge. So what's the plausibility of Garlascelli's hypothesis? Historically, first of all, scientifically and historically, it's totally implausible because unlike what he reports, he didn't use one method. He used two entirely different techniques, which produced two entirely different results. So for example, his first results didn't necessarily record the superficiality. That's what he used to get 3D. But it was in his second round of experiments, a different set of experiments, where he records that, I had some superficial results. So he doesn't have one coherent method that a single medieval artist could have used to reproduce the shroud. He's got two entirely different experiments with contradictory results. Doesn't work. Furthermore, there's no historical precedence for this kind of artistic technique at all. As art expert Isabel Pixek, this technique didn't come into existence until the 17th century or possibly as late as the 19th century. And, here's a quote from Isabel Pixek on that front. Adversity within the history of art, with the history of the development of art technology, and with the authority of the professional practice arts, finely ground pigments, drawing techniques of photographic accuracy, pastel portraits, and the very thought of a negative image on a burial shroud do not fit the milieu of the Middle Ages. So this is comparable to it's like Freeman Dyson makes this comparable example. You could say, well, all of the raw materials and the basic concepts necessary to make a spacecraft traveling outside of our galaxy maybe they exist all right here in the 21st century here on Earth. But it would be ridiculous for someone living 1,000 years from now to say, yeah, human beings in the 21st century were capable of building such spacecraft and traveling to another galaxy. No, it just doesn't fit the milieu of the Middle Age, of our time period. Explanatory scope and power. How does Garlo Shelley do here? Well, I'm just going to target the features that James mentions, and those are only two of the minimal relevant features: three-dimensionality and vertical mapping. Luigi Garlo Shelley himself admitted that at best he only reproduced some of the shroud's three-dimensional effect in his experimental results, as all bas-reliefs inherently contain some three-dimensional information. So you're always going to get some three-dimensional qualities. The question is it sufficiently similar in quality to the shroud? And there it's not. As people have looked at Garlo Shelley's results, it's almost made of flat plateau, which represent contact zones, and valleys, which represent no contact zones, with abrupt vertical cliffs. That's contrary to what we see with the shroud, where it has fine degrees of variation or elevation, right? Think of the tip of the nose all the way down to the bottoms of the cheeks. It represents all those differing degrees of three-dimensionality with a fine gradation. Garlo Shelley's methods don't do that in the VP8 image analyzer. And as Heimberger pointed out when he studied, quote unquote, we must realize that modern artists and researchers, including Garlo Shelley, know what they have to work with in such a way as to try and produce shroud-like images with these properties. To date, all have failed. But what is the probability that a medieval forger, who obviously could not have anticipated the shroud's three-dimensionality or photonegativity, just producing these features by chance? It's probably about 0%. What about the vertical mapping? This is something where this is also Luigi Garlo Shelley has utterly failed. It's an absolute inconsistency, and bas-relief techniques are inherently incapable of this. What's my proof? I'm going to quote the Shroud Skeptic that James does, Cicero Mores. He's a personal friend of mine. We've had disagreements on my blog together as friends. I consider him, he's a great guy. But even in his personal talks, Cicero Mores says, yeah, all I argued in my paper is that bas-reliefs produce much better results in terms of the vertical mapping feature compared to a three-dimensional body. And of course, that's true. The wraparound distortion effect has been known of since beyond the 1930s, right? We have the Mask of Agamemnon. It's been known about for a long time. Nobody cares about that. Of course, a bas-relief performs better than wrapping a full three-dimensional statue or body, but no pro-shroud person has ever said that or denied that. But the point is, inherently, bas-reliefs still produce lateral distortions, which make it inconsistent with the vertical collimation of the Shroud of Turin's images. And again, Cicero himself admitted that to me personally. So his paper is not proof that a bas-relief was used to form the shroud images. Okay, next he goes to the motivations. He speaks about motivations, and he gives two arguments. First is that there's general medieval gullibility, and there's fake relics galore. Totally admit that. But we can't assume that because there are a bunch of fake relics that therefore the shroud must be a fake as well. No, we need direct evidence for that. Otherwise, you're committing the fallacy of guilt by association. So I just think this is irrelevant. He goes into the archipoeta, and I probably mispronounced that too, James. Icons, right? This means not made with human hands. In other words, there are certain images that were known in the Byzantine world to be not made with human hands, miraculous. They weren't painted. And I think James's argument here is, look, there was so many of these and imaged shrouds or images that were archipoeta, so there's nothing special about the Shroud of Turin. But unfortunately, this is just not historically true. In fact, there are only a total of 4 objects in the entire history of humanity that had this title ascribed to them by the Byzantines. This is the image of Beirut, the image of Memphis, the image of God incarnate, and the image of Edessa. But when we look at those images, the image of Beirut and the image of Memphis, we have a well-established history. They are totally inconsistent with a first century date, so they can be ruled out. And in terms of, it's only the image of Edessa and the image of God incarnate, which can be traced back with a plausible history to the first century. And of those two, only the image of God incarnate, which is known to have been full-length imaged linen cloth of Jesus, And this is according to secular pre-14th century history. I'm talking about secular Byzantine historians.
1 minute remaining.
Son of a gun. Okay, I went too slow. So he raises a bunch of other stuff in terms of anatomical inaccuracies, and these have been proven to be wrong. So, for example, he says the body's about 8 heads tall. Well, that's perfectly consistent with what art says, right? You have an adult is supposed to be about 8 heads tall. So that's following the 8-head rule and is therefore consistent. And I had a bunch of other stuff to say the proportions of the body are perfectly consistent. There have been dozens upon dozens of medical experts who studied it who all say this, including a 1999 computerized anthropometric study, which also confirmed this as well. So there's nothing disproportional about the body in terms of its general speakings. Now, in terms of the long arm and fingers, these are due to certain effects, such as the wraparound distortion effect that James is already aware of. So Gilbert Lavoie proved that's not an issue, and I'll stop right there.
No, well, that's okay. I mean, that's time right there. But do we? I mean, like, I'd be okay if you have a lot more to get through. I'm okay adding to your time as long as I add to James's time. But
sure,
I want to defer to the two of you.
As long as James is cool with that, it's up to James, I guess. You good?
Yeah, maybe we can do 15 if you want to.
Okay. All right. I'm happy to do that. I'll add another 5 minutes then.
And sorry, that's my fault. I took too long on the beginning stuff. So, okay, cool. So James also mentions that there's one of the arms is longer than the others, and that's definitely apparent. The STURP scientists mentioned this, or that the fingers appear to be elongated. But are these actual provable inaccuracies with the body? No. There have been various explanations by medical experts. I personally think that Dr. Gilbert Lavoie has conclusively refuted this in his paper. And he's actually measured, when you measure properly, considering the position of the body and curvature. Remember, all skeptics, they like Cicero Morris. They know about the wraparound effect when it helps them argue for a bas relief, but they seem to forget about these wraparound distortion effects when it comes to proving the shroud. And that's the answer here. Gilbert Lavoie has proven when you account for these distortion effects, actually the arm is perfectly consistent with each other. He's actually measured it. And the fingers, which are curved, that's what's producing this elongated effect. And you can see he's proven this through his paper and done actual experiments showing why it appears this way. But in reality, the Shroud Man is perfectly anatomically correct, as confirmed by the 1999 computerized anthropometric study done by various Marinelli and various experts. Now, James says the body posture is impossible. Teddy Pappas is probably screaming in her boots right now because no, she's an expert in this area specifically. And no, we actually have real life experiments from going back to Isabel Pixak. And then you showed a picture from Giulio Fonte's rigorous analysis showing exactly how the body was as depicted in the shroud, the shoulders hunched forward and that sort of thing. And then one knee higher than the other. And this is an account for why we get one of Jesus' thighs as a chicken leg. It's called the tenting effect. That makes sense if you have a real body. Doesn't make sense for a medieval artist who's so smart he can create these amazingly accurate images, but then he's so dumb that he creates one leg as a chicken leg and the other as a regular sized leg. No, that only makes sense because there was a real body and there was a tenting effect. One leg was higher than the other and they were both bent. And again, these have been scientifically proven in experiments. We have achieved this position. Now, how did they get into this position? It's because it's based on what Jesus was on the cross. And he entered, as Teddy Pappas in her medically peer-reviewed paper says, either cadaveric spasm and or rigor mortis, and stayed in that position. And then they broke the rigor mortis with respect to the hands to cover, for his modesty, to cover that. But the body itself remained in rigor mortis, the parts that weren't, where rigor mortis was not broken. And again, this is published in a medically peer-reviewed journal where they prove this. And it includes a paper of a study conducted over 150 years, from 1811 until 1960 or something like that, by H.J. Melick. And he proves that the rigor mortis could have lasted this long. On average, the total resolution of rigor mortis takes about 76 hours. and even has an upper limit in certain conditions of about 140 hours or 5.8 days. So, yeah, rigor mortis. Yeah, could the body still have been rigor mortis 3 days? Within the 3 days when the Bible alleges Jesus rose from the dead. Yep, and that would be consistent with what we see on the Shroud Man. Okay, next he goes to dating the shroud. So this is, again, it's irrelevant, but let's pretend it is relevant for the sake of argument. How do I respond? So he brings up the Darcy Memorandum, and I like that he updated his slides to include the Bishop Oresme, because he's an earlier document that was just discovered last year. And Nicholas Sarsgaard
1 minute remaining.
Oh, okay. Now, the problem with this document is, look, you can't just believe a document written 40 years later. Otherwise, I'll just say, read the Gospel of Mark, resurrection happened, game over. No, Darcy had a financial motive to lie, provable from the church finances, and the external evidence actually contradicts him. We have no record of an official inquiry. We should. There's no record of an artist confessing. And we even have a letter from Bishop Henry, the one who allegedly held this inquiry, contradicting this Darcy memo from 40 years later, where he says, I praise, ratify, and approve of the Leary Church and the divine cult, and says that that's great. Okay, and we also have documents that date earlier. So I'll just end with this since I have 1 minute. One of the things, I go for the image of God incarnate. Forget the image of Edessa hypothesis. I think there's another view, the image of God incarnate. One of the texts dates to 568, called the Chronicle of Pseudo-Zechariah.
That is actually time, but if you want to finish your sentence, I think that's reasonable.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, hopefully it's interesting at least. But so this is a full-length imaged linen cloth with images not made with human hands, and it was ordered to be paraded around by the Emperor Justinian. But here's the independent verification that's very interesting. So it's right at this time that Byzantine art standardizes the Pantocrator type images of Jesus. So it would make sense if you hypothesize the shroud was the inspiration for the Pantocrator images. And it's once that was rediscovered, that's why it standardized the authoritative look of Jesus. But not only that, we have what's called, coming in at this period, the crux mensurales, meaning the measurement cross. For the first time in history, the Byzantines are like, we know exactly the measurements of Jesus up on that cross. And guess what? From the measurements they get 178 centimeters high. Well, that's the same as the Shroud Man. The Shroud Man just happens to be, again,
I feel like as the moderator, I should point that we're pretty far over time. So
okay, I'll stop.
Yeah. What I'll do then is I'm going to give James 17 minutes just to be pretty even. We do have a free discussion period, so I hope we'll get to all of these points, and I think every argument is going to be adequately represented. But okay, I'll turn it back over to James, and let me share. This is. Do you want me to? These are your slides.
Okay. I'll just share my. I have a few slides here. I'll just share because of the issue. Yes, thank you. From last time. So,
and maybe while James is pulling this up, I just want to compliment both speakers. Those were really wonderful presentations. I also want to say that behind the scenes, they've both been really great, not only with me, but with each other. We'll highlight their channels a little bit later, but they'll be in the discussion section as well. And they've been kind enough to share all their slides with each other. So I think that's why this argument is going to be such a high level discussion. All right, let me add your presentation. Okay, there we go. And I'll go ahead and start the time whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks, Dale, for excuse me. Thanks, Dale, for your comments. So I won't be able to respond to everything that Dale has said in his opening and also rebuttal. Hopefully, we can get to some of that in our open discussion. I want to address some major themes. So I want to discuss the religion authenticating miracles framework that Dale introduced in his initial slides. So the core idea here is that come back to that. The core idea seems to be here that the criteria are satisfied when there is an independently given religious context, and that within that context there is some event, or in this case an artifact, which arises that is extraordinary to an ordinary person, like not requiring a lot of expertise. and that the viewed in the context of that extraordinary event or artifact and the independent religious context, we can infer that or at least a reasonable person can infer that the extraordinary event, in this case the shroud, is a divine vindication of that religious context. In this case, it would be the resurrection of Jesus. So hopefully I've appropriately summarized that idea here. Now, what I want to articulate here is that from my perspective, and I mean, I think this should be reasonably clear to someone who is not necessarily a proponent of the shroud, these criteria are designed to make it impossible to demonstrate that the shroud does not have a divine origin. The criteria have a number of features that mean that it's only possible to provide evidence in favor of the shroud and impossible to provide evidence that the shroud is a human artifact. So in particular, the RAM criteria do not, at least as Dale articulated them, and he can, of course, feel free to provide further clarification later, that they do not allow for any contradictory evidence. And we've seen this. We've seen how Dale shrugs off the 14th century dating of the shroud using the radiocarbon dating as simply being irrelevant to his criteria, because it actually, none of the criteria require that there be a balancing of evidences of whether of those that support a miraculous origin for the shroud against those that don't. And so any evidence that's presented is simply ignored because that's not one of the criteria. The criteria is just, is there an independent religious context, and does the shroud appear extraordinary to an ordinary person? So all contrary evidence can be essentially ignored. Another problem with these criteria is that there is no attempt to show that the shroud can be explained better by supernatural processes. So Dale does not attempt at all. He did mention briefly, but he also said that he's not going to present it in the presentation, and he didn't explain it. So he didn't attempt to articulate what a supernatural process would be for forming the shroud. Saying that the shroud could be produced by a basic divine action doesn't actually explain the shroud. Remember what a good explanation for the shroud should be. It should explain the when, the what, the how, and the why. So plausibly, the divine basic action only explains the how. It doesn't explain any of the other things. It doesn't explain why the shroud dates to the Middle Ages, or why it only has documentary evidence to the Middle Ages. It doesn't explain why it has the artistic features that I outlined. It doesn't explain why God would make a shroud that has these properties, which we'll get to in a moment, which in many ways are quite misleading to a potential believer. So the point is, just saying God did it doesn't actually explain any of the relevant features of the shroud. What we should be trying to do is compare the explanatory virtues of what I'm the particular naturalistic hypothesis that I'm outlining based on the Gala-Shelley technique and the medieval dating against whatever it is that Dale would articulate as his vision for how and why the shroud came to be. God did it doesn't explain anything. It simply says that there is a divine origin, but without actually being able to draw any explanatory inferences that accounts for the specific features. So that's another weaknesses of the RAM criteria, is that it simply only looks at whether the shroud appears extraordinary and not whether there's an actual explanatory hypothesis on the supernatural side. A final problem with the criteria that Dale's advocated is that there's no allowance here for unknown natural processes. In fact, it would seem to me that every single unknown process that if an ordinary person looks up at the sky and hears and sees thunder, and they don't understand about the electrical processes that go into making that, and that they view that thunder and hear it in a context of following a religious event, or even just when they prayed or were thinking about something, that to them would seem to satisfy the RAM criteria. Not just in previous times, but even in the present time, because an ordinary person may not know about the mechanisms that give rise to thunder or lightning or any other religious icon or literally anything that ever happens ever. So the point is that these criteria are, I think, hopelessly inadequate for someone who's actually genuinely interested in trying to assess what the best explanation is for the shroud. The criteria that Dale has advocated are designed, it seems, to be impossible to come to any other conclusion. They don't allow for any contradictory evidence to be weighed. They don't allow for any consideration of how well the event is explained or the shroud is explained by supernatural hypotheses. And they don't allow for any unknown naturalistic processes. Anything that cannot be perfectly explained by natural processes is identified, and Dale's shown this with many of his rebuttal slides, as somehow evidence for a supernatural origin, instead of what it really is just something we don't know. Not everything that we don't know is evidence for a supernatural origin. If, for example, the Gala-Shelley technique, just to give an example of this point, produces a shroud that has a slightly different depth of the number of fibers that are discolored compared to the real shroud, that is not evidence for the supernatural origin of the shroud. Why not? Because the supernatural explanation doesn't explain why the shroud has that many fibers that are discolored either. In order to say that that evidence favors the supernatural hypothesis, what you have to show is that that event, or this particular piece of evidence, I should say, the degree of superficiality is more expected or is better explained by the supernatural hypothesis, by the miracle hypothesis, than it is by a rival natural hypothesis. It's not enough just to say that something's not perfectly explained by a natural hypothesis, and therefore it must be supernatural. That's not how any type of inference works in history, in the legal process, in science. And so I think it's just a completely unreasonable criteria or approach that Dale is advocating for here, and both advocating for and also using implicitly. So those are some general points that I wanted to mention at the outset. Now, in terms of specifically why the shroud is a bad exemplar of a religiously authenticating miracle, well, because the shroud wasn't known for most of history. It only appeared in the late Middle Ages. And even then, it was only known to a small group of people. Even today, most people don't know about the shroud, despite the fact that it's been much more widely popularized after the first photographic negative of it was developed in, I think, the 1890s. That's when it got, I mean, it was known before then, but it got much more attention because it's much more compelling in the photographic negative than in the positive. The special features that Dale mentioned, and I think that this is attention in his case, for example, the table that he presented and the many scientific studies, those are only known to experts who study them, who study the shroud. Those are not known to the ordinary person. The ordinary person only just looks at the shroud and sees an image of Jesus. And in fact, for most of history, they only saw the photo-positive version of the shroud, which just looks like a faint version of someone who of a purported burial shroud of someone who was evidently crucified in the manner of Jesus. So the special features seem to be irrelevant by Dale's own account because they're only evident to experts and therefore aren't relevant to the religious authenticating miracle criteria that Dale outlined. And as I've also explained, the features of the shroud that are compelling, such as the nature, the superficial nature of the image, as in like to a non-expert, are undermined by equivocal or contradictory evidence, like the fact of the carbon dating, like the fact that it doesn't appear in the historical record until the 14th century, like the implausible anatomical aspects that I've discussed. Now, we also have to consider that if God's purpose was to provide a vindicatory miracle of his resurrection, he just seems to have chosen in the shroud a very poor way to go about this. Because, as I've said, the shroud didn't appear until very long into history, and it wasn't known to very many people, and it's just not really clear evidence of anything other than that someone was buried. It's not even very clear evidence of a resurrection. You sort of have to, at best, you have to look at some of the special features that Dale's mentioned, but that's not evident to a non-expert. There are so many better options available to the omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent creator of the universe, who allegedly is the architect of the shroud. I've just given my favorite example here, which I mentioned in other debates. God could simply appear to people around the world, in the Americas or China or elsewhere, either at the time of the resurrection or subsequently. If you think that for some reason that's off the table for God to do, I don't know why it would be, but another possibility would be that God could inspire people in other cultures to produce very clear products of a Christian influence, such as the shroud, but place them in a context where no credible historical trajectory could explain them. And this actually nicely ties things together, because my account would not be able to explain the shroud as it exists if it had been discovered in the pre-Columbian Americas, dating to the 14th century, which is before contact. That would very much strain any sort of naturalistic hypothesis that I could come up with, and be very strong evidence for some sort of supernatural or at least supernormal explanation. Even better if it actually dated to the 1st century and then appeared in these sorts of contexts as well. So the point I'm making here is that the postulated reason for the existence of the shroud, that it's a vindicatory miracle, does not fit the features of the shroud. It doesn't fit the 14th century date. It doesn't fit the fact that there's nothing obviously supernatural about the shroud to an observer. It just looks like an image on a cloth. It doesn't fit the ability of God to do any number of other things that would be very clear and unequivocal evidence of his divine status. So this is one of the reasons I think that the supernatural hypothesis is just completely bereft of explanatory power. It doesn't account for any of the features of the shroud, nor does it explain really even why it should exist. And that's why I mentioned, just to bring up something that Dale mentioned, that's why I discussed the medieval context of the relic industry and the interest in icons, because that does account for why it would exist. We see a series of sociological and historical reasons that explain the origin of the shroud and make sense of it in that context. People producing these sort of artifacts, we know that they did this. We don't know that God did any other similar miracles. And so it seems reasonable to say that the natural hypothesis that I account for, the medieval artistic hypothesis, is much more consistent with the context that we know. We know that people were making artifacts. We know that people were making images. We know their motivations for doing so, either a pious or for monetary gain, depending on whether you think it was fraudulent or a pious iconography. But either way, those are known and understood motivations which account for the existence of the shroud. God's motivation does not account for the existence of the shroud in the way that is stated. And there's one important aspect of this that I also wanted to mention, which is that the most obvious and clear aspect of the shroud that is obvious to anyone who knows anything about Christianity is that it purports to be it presents itself as being the burial shroud of Jesus. That's just evident from all of the features, the crucifixion features and the artistic conventions and so forth. Now, the problem with that is, as I've shown, a linen cloth laid over a corpse does not produce an image like this. It's impossible. The distortions make it so that particularly the face will not show an image like is shown on the shroud, excuse me. Now, it's odd to me that Dale brushes this off by saying everyone knows that the bas-relief produces a better image like this than a real body, but no one cares about it. But does no one care about the fact that God has produced, allegedly, according to Dale's hypothesis, produced this miraculous artifact, which purports to be, which obviously at its face value is supposed to be the burial shroud of Jesus, but which actually cannot be the burial shroud of Jesus produced by any method known in terms of like placing a linen cloth on a body. Seems to me that it's clearly in some way devious or misleading of God to do this, because it purports to be something that it cannot be. You have to invoke a wholly separate and entirely unprecedented mechanism, as Dale does, for the sort of collimated vertical connection of the image to the radiation emitting from the body, or just say that God just made it that way. But remember, and I want to emphasize this point, of course, God could make the shroud any way he wants. He's omnipotent, right? But the question is, why would he make it that way? The claim of Dale and other shroud proponents is that God deliberately made the shroud in a way which misleads the viewer. It misleads the viewer into thinking that they are looking at the burial shroud of Jesus produced by contact with the body, when it cannot be that, just through the fact that the distortions don't work. Not to mention the radiocarbon dating. Of course, people would historically not have known about that. But to the modern audience, that also adds to the problem. Why does God try to vindicate his status in such an equivocal, unconvincing, and misleading, deceptive way? I don't think that that is what we would reasonably expect from the omniscient, omnibenevolent creator and sustainer of the universe. A few final points before we finish up here. We have many artifacts from history whose origins and construction and purpose are not fully known. I'm showing here several of them: the Antikythera mechanism, crystal skulls, Greek fire, and Stonehenge. We know some things about these artifacts, but we can't duplicate any of these at the moment, certainly not using technologies available at the time. Does that mean that we should invoke a supernatural explanation for them? No, it doesn't, because it just means that we don't know everything about history. And in particular, the criteria that Dale implicitly uses is that the skeptic must account for every single precise detail of the shroud and be able to replicate this using contemporary techniques to arbitrary precision. There's no limit to what tiny details Dale has compared to that needs to be replicated precisely by a modern practitioner. Now, my question for Dale, maybe we can talk about this, is where this criterion comes from, because I'm not aware of any other approach in history which requires this, which requires us to precisely replicate a historical artifact in order to explain it. What we need to do is show the historical context in which it exists, have reasonable explanations as to why it was created, and plausible techniques to show how it was created using methods available at the time. We have these for the shroud. So that is sufficient to render plausible the explanation that I'm advocating for. We do not need to account for every single precise detail, nor do we need to replicate every detail to arbitrary precision. And there's also a built-in bias here, because Dale doesn't explain why any of the features he discusses are important, like the superficiality on the fibers, for example. Why is that expected under a supernatural hypothesis? There's no reason given. Any feature that the shroud has, Dale says, needs to be precisely replicated by some sort of modern reproduction, but he doesn't need to give any account as to why, under his view, the shroud has these features. So I think there's an inherent tension here about the criteria that are being used to assess the two different explanations. Let me briefly summarize where I see the debate at this point. My explanation of the shroud is it was produced by a medieval artist in the 14th century. Dale's explanation is that in some unspecified way, it was produced by divine miracle.
One minute remaining.
Now, I've identified 4 characteristics here. We'll hopefully talk more about these in the discussion. I don't think that the anatomy of the shroud, the long limbs, the elongated fingers, and the abnormal posture is well accounted for by the fact that it's an actual burial shroud. You don't put a corpse in this position. Rigor mortis does not render it impossible to move the limbs of a corpse. It just doesn't make any sense. No one says this outside of the shroud, but it fits with the artistic conventions of the medieval ages. The radiocarbon dating obviously fits with the medieval hypothesis as well as the textual evidence. Dale doesn't even try to explain why the shroud dates from that period. The projection distortions fit with the use of bas relief with artistic touch-ups. Dale doesn't try to explain why God deliberately made the shroud to appear to be a burial cloth when it can't actually be a burial cloth, placed over a body. The Gallicelli technique explains how the superficiality of the image in terms of discoloration of the fibers arose. Dale doesn't have anything to say about why God would make the shroud look like this. So overall, I think that the medieval artist technique accounts for the features of the shroud, the what, where, the who, and the why, much better than Dale's hypothesis of a miracle. Thanks very much.
Wow, those were great presentations. And again, I'm very grateful. It's really very, I can't tell you how pleased I am to be hosting this conversation on my channel. I'm really very honored by both of your contributions and your participation and your thoughts. We now have 50 minutes of a free discussion. I'm open to both of you how you want to do that. If you want to talk to each other for a bit, my suggestion would be let's go to the comments really quickly, because I want to kind of reward the people who have been tuning in for a lot of the stretch of the debate. So Is it okay if we do that, and then I'll let you guys chat with each other, and we'll all right, let's go through some of these comments. I do want to say Theodora Pappas is in the chat, and so I'm really grateful for that. Really fantastic researcher. I've listened to several of her lectures, including a big lecture that she did on the Shroud that I recommend everybody check out. And I'll try and remember to put that in the description of this video as well. I know she's been answering some questions, and I've highlighted a few of your comments, so let's go through those just really quickly. Hopefully I got to all of them. Here's another one. The shroud proves that Jesus died, to contradict swoon theory. Death is shown via rigor mortis and cadaveric spasm. Reaction time is necessary between infusion of life energy. So any thoughts on this, or any reflections, or Dale or James?
Yeah, I'll just say, so Teddy, the person speaking here, is actually the expert in shroud studies on this particular issue. And like I said, she's the one who published in a medical journal, peer-reviewed medical journal, about all of the findings and how about the body position in rigor mortis and how that works, and all the details there. So yeah, I think she has a lot of great stuff in her paper. So I would just highly recommend people read that. I'm not a fan of her life energy stuff, but if we're talking supernatural, you got to be open, I guess, to whatever. So yeah.
James, any thoughts?
I won't comment on the specifics of that paper. I haven't read it, but I think that the broader point here about invoking unprecedented and otherwise unmotivated supernatural notions like life energy and a variety of others that I've seen, not just this particular one, is indicative of the limitations or problems in the Shroud literature, because there's a very clear set of methodologies that naturalistic researchers historically and chemically need to follow, or the radiocarbon dating being an example, to explain how something could have originated through natural means. There don't seem to be any restrictions on what can be argued from a supernatural point of view. So I think that's why I argue that Dale's criteria, as far as I'm concerned, make it impossible for any skeptical argument to ever get off the ground, because there is just a vast chasm between what's required of the skeptic and what's required of the Shroud defender. And I think that that's a genuine problem here that maybe will impede our ability to see eye to eye on this issue.
Great. Zara says, go ahead and ask your questions. I will try to get back to the chat and I've flagged a lot of your questions. And thank you, Zara, for reminding people several times in the chat to do that. She also says, remember to like and subscribe. That'd be really great. I'll be highlighting both the channels of the speakers, and I have that in my starred comments as well. Let's do this question. Darklight, I think that's the correct name. Asked this a few different questions. Actually, let me go to this question. I haven't heard this argument made, so maybe this is a novel argument. First century Judean Jewish men wore their hair short. The shroud has a more Catholic European looking Jesus. Any thoughts on this, Dale or James?
I get it. Okay. I guess I'll go first. So this is just not true. So again, it's in terms of this claim, this is a claim that is relatively common among Shroud skeptics, and pro Shroud defenders and experts have already addressed it. So Dr. Gary Habermas goes with his answer. First of all, short. What do you mean by short? That's different in different times and different cultures. It's not necessarily a 1950s haircut. So short in the first century Jewish context is about shoulder length hair, which is what we see exactly with the Shroud Man. Remember, there are also differences. Jesus was a rural Jew from up in Galilee, not in Jerusalem or associated with a Hellenistic city and that sort of thing. So, and I myself, on the Arch of Titus, saw a bunch of Jews that were taken captured. Most of them do have the short Greco-Roman hairstyle, short curly hair, like short 1950s standard. But there's actually at least two that have shoulder length hairs depicted. So, there's nothing implausible about this. Another explanation, I don't go for this, but another explanation, there's the Nazirite vow. So I'll just say there's nothing historically implausible about this, and that's the reason Shroud skeptics like Hugh Farey will not use this as a valid objection.
Gotcha. Any thoughts, James?
No, I don't have anything to add. I don't think it's too equivocal either way, so I didn't mention it.
Gotcha. I put my own comments in the chat just to highlight your channels. This is a channel from Dale of Real Seekers, really fantastic apologetical channel. This is James's channel, also really great content creator, James. And also check out his website. There's a lot of educational resources across a lot of different fields and disciplines, like a PowerPoint on a map of the solar system. Really great content there. So please do support both of these individuals. I'd recommend right now, please subscribe to James's channel, and please subscribe also to Dale's channel. I don't know the answer to this question, but Teddy asked this question. How much contamination is needed to skew the date?
So regarding the radiocarbon dating, so I cited the source that I used on there. So rather than just try to replicate that, I would suggest checking that out. But I think it's so. I want to use the opportunity here to comment on a broader point. So particularly in his rebuttal, Dale made reference to numerous studies that have been put out by Shroud proponents in defense of various aspects or critiquing like Gala Shelley's reproduction and other sorts of things. Now, I'm extremely, I'm sure Dale is aware, very skeptical of many of these studies. I can't speak to the specifics without having looked at them. And Dale, which is one of my broad critiques, doesn't really tell us about any of the specifics. Almost all of his slides were, and this Shroud defender tells us in this scientifically peer-reviewed study, and then states their conclusion. As a skeptic, there's no real ability for me to assess anything about that, particularly because I have looked at some of these papers and find them extremely wanting methodologically. So that's absolutely linking that back to the question, it's absolutely a valid question to ask about the assumptions that are made in making these calculations. That's why I recommend having a look at the study. I mean, the key point is simply that when you're radiocarbon dating something, the mass of the material is what drives the date. And so if you're going to argue that a first century substance dated to the 14th century, you need an enormous amount of contaminant from later periods in order to create that distortion. Now, I mean, there's other things you can critique. For example, there's the issue about the how the I presented the raw uncalibrated dates which are calculated like before present. There's a process for calibrating those to a calendar year, and there's certain assumptions that are made in that. These are the advantage I think that we have approaching these things from a naturalistic scientific point of view is that we have well-established standards for doing this. Radiocarbon dating is an incredibly well validated and widely used technique, and so we can assess those on their merits. Now, my critique is that many of the claims that Dale makes and many of the publications that present them use novel techniques, or they are presented in dubious journals, or they're presented from a very clear pro-Shroud bias that is specifically focused on an agenda to establish the validity of the Shroud. I've deliberately tried to minimize the number of references I present to like anti-Shroud materials. I did present a few, but for the most part, I've just tried to present sources that describe scientific or historical like practices and evidences. And the challenge is, once one gets into the details, it becomes difficult to work through all the specifics. But I think that that's why it's important to try to present these and the assumptions as clearly as possible. And that's a general problem that I have with Dale, as that he just presents a lot of conclusions from people who agree with him, and there's no way for me to assess those.
Thoughts on this, Dale?
Yeah, so on this, so in terms of, I actually would agree with James that in terms of ordinary forms of contamination, I think scientists have said, look, the amount of contamination that would be needed would be so evident, you would see the effects with the naked eye, kind of thing. So that there's a reason why the majority of pro-Shroud scientists today don't think ordinary contamination is at the very least a full explanation. I'm open to it as perhaps some kind of partial contributing factor kind of thing, right? It just depends if, you would have to modify Bob Rucker's neutron hypothesis to accommodate that. But yeah, in terms of what Teddy's saying here, in terms of the presumptions, so she's coming from sort of like the three assumptions that young Earth creationists would say, right? So with carbon dating, you have to assume what were the initial amounts, and you have to assume what's the radioactive half-life. Does that change under certain conditions? And I think she's trying to say we can't just assume it would stay the same at 57, 30 years. Half the carbon 14 decays every 5,730 years. Maybe it changes all the time. I personally disagree with that. I go with the scientific consensus, but Teddy's right that that's one of the three assumptions that goes in. The third assumption, this is where I think pro-Shroud guys mostly come in, is there is no leakage, contamination of insertions of extra material, or leakage, artificial leakage of material. And that's typically where the pro-Shroud guys go, right? We say there is contamination, but Teddy is questioning the second assumption and saying, well, how do we know the radioactive half-life stayed the same at all times?
Well, yeah, great points to both of you on that. Let me do a couple of rapid fire ones really quickly. The re-examination show says, let's go. Just wanted to say, glad you're here. This is a really great channel, re-examination show. If people want to check that out, it's a really fantastic channel. Let me do this one from LA Apologetics. There's no doubt the Shroud is 100% authentic. LA Apologetics is a relatively, I want to say, new content creator, been moderating on a few channels for a while, but really glad you're here. So glad that you joined the conversation. Just wanted to highlight your channel. Robin Webster is an atheistic channel. Really fantastic channel. Robin has a really great channel. Recommend you check that out as well. And let me do a couple of other really rapid fire ones. TNC Apologetics, also really great channel. Glad you're here. Glad you're checking this out. Slave of Elijah says, never seen you moderate a debate before. Really glad that you're here, Elijah. You've got a great channel as well. TNC
Is that actually your son? He calls you dad. He or she calls you dad.
That's not my son. I don't have children. I think that's just a joke about me being old or something. No, I mean, it's meant kindly, clearly, but yeah, I don't have children, but I mean, not that. Yeah, Elijah would be a great child, I'm sure. If I had a child, I'm sure I'd be very proud of him. But really great channel is the bottom line. And that's a bit more of an inside joke. But anyways, TNC Apologetics, thanks for pointing out that we're at 900 subs. TNC Apologetics also has a really fantastic channel.
Tavo, you might just want to point out that Modern Atheism has a terrible channel, because I see them mocking you about saying everyone has a fantastic channel.
And they're here too, so good to see you, Modern Atheism. All right, here's let me see. There's a question for, I probably highlighted too many questions, but let me see here. Okay, question for Dale from Philos of Eric asks, are there any other relics that you think are authentic?
Okay, so yes, it's not a heck of a lot, but for example, the Sudarium of Oviedo is another relic. This is the purported head cloth that covered Jesus' head while he was up on the cross and was used to transport him to the tomb when it was there cast aside, as the Gospel of John says. So that's a relic that I think is authentic. And the reason is because it has been there's forensic evidence linking it to the Shroud of Turin. Basically, the shroud and the sudarium covered the same bloody head. And that's based on a forensic analysis of the various blood stains and body fluids on the cloth. And they can estimate anatomical proportions, which are very similar as well.
So I'm really curious about that, Dale. How can they establish that it was the same individual in both cases?
It's based on the blood flow patterns and that sort of thing, and how they trace it back. Okay, he would have the same wounds in the same size and location on the body, and that sort of thing. They can estimate about the nose size and stuff like that, which is similar for both people. There's evident swelling, I guess, by how it affects the flows in the same location on the right cheek and stuff like that. So that's, from my understanding, that's how they do it. Caesar Barta wrote an entire book on this. He did specific experiments trying to prove, because one of the skeptics come back to this is, they'll just say, well, look, any random blood flows, you're going to get some kind of common overlap, and that's true, but it's to the remarkable degree. So Caesar Barta has demonstrated through experiments that there's a 75% degree of correspondence. Now you can't get that through random distributions of like wounds and then blood flows. And he did this using his own daughter, which was kind of weird. And they didn't get anywhere close to the 75% degree of correspondence. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is a good opportunity for me to make, again, a general comment. Having not read that book, I can't comment on the specifics. But my issue here, and because I have read some papers that apply novel approaches or techniques for identifying the shroud, I'm always, for studying the shroud, I should say. And I'm always very skeptical about these because the people going into them usually have a particular objective, and then they develop a technique which, lo and behold, it shows that they're, or a specific approach that confirms what they already thought. Now, this is not just a problem for people who affirm the authenticity of the shroud. I'm absolutely point that out. This is a problem in all areas of research. But that's why it's so important that the techniques that we use are validated using other samples or other examples. And I highlight that in the case of the carbon dating of the shroud. Carbon dating is not a technique that was developed for the shroud. It's extremely well validated and used, extremely widely used in archaeology and in many other applications. And in the specific case of that carbon dating, they dated 3 other artifacts that were of known provenance. So these factors in combination make me very confident that the technique does tell us when the linen of the shroud originated. Now, by contrast, when someone develops a technique specifically or does an analysis, like someone who was a shroud advocate then does an analysis and they tell me that there's some 75% correspondence, which they validated against their own daughter, that's just not convincing to me. I have no idea how many researcher degrees of freedom there were in making that assessment. And I don't know whether it would replicate if done by other researchers or if applied to other bodies. Like if we had a wide range of different cloths that had covered the same body and some that had covered different, how reliable would this technique be in correctly identifying the ones that were placed on the same body versus different? Now, I'm not asking you, Dale, to have all the specific answers to that. The broader point I'm making is when you cite these sorts of specific and often lengthy analyses by shroud proponents, often using novel methodologies or techniques, I have no ability as a skeptic to assess those because they haven't been, at least the majority of the look at, that they haven't been validated in the same way that, say, radiocarbon dating is. So feel free to respond to that, but that's like a general concern from a skeptical point of view of, have these methods been validated and replicated appropriately, like radiocarbon dating has?
Yeah, so I'll respond twofold. So, and again, my interest in doing debates is for truth. So I'm going to admit something that helps you here, is that in terms of the forensic analysis on the sudarium versus shroud, there have been several forensic experts who come to this conclusion. They are all pro-shroud, so that has to be admitted, kind of thing. But so, you can be wary. I think that's let's be wary. They've got a bias, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. Let's look at the results.
No, but it's about the technique that they use and its applicability elsewhere. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to come to that. So now you call this a novel technique. No, it's not. Blood pattern analysis has been established and used in the court system for decades. In fact, a couple of Shroud skeptics in 2018, Luigi Garlascelli, your favorite, also used blood pattern analysis and published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. Now, he used that to conclude the shroud was a fake, but obviously the technique is valid of blood pattern analysis. So that's not a novel thing. It's well established in the literature. So yeah, you've got to read. Obviously, I would argue, well, why don't I believe in Luigi's results? It's because that those 2018 experiments were based on heavily flawed assumptions and also flawed methodologies. So yeah, that's where
but this is the point, though, that it all depends on the specifics. A lot of scientifically poorly validated techniques are used in the legal system. I think blood pattern analysis is one of those. Of course, there's different specifics there. But I asked about a very specific question here. If you use the same methodology, can you reliably identify cloths that have overlaid the same bloody body versus different ones? And if that's been validated, then and the same techniques were used, then that would be what I'd want to know as a skeptic. My point is actually not demanding that you provide the citation right here. That would be unfair. I'm trying to articulate, and this is partly in response to some questions from chat, the sorts of things that I come to the table with as a skeptic trying to answer these questions. I think, okay, so someone makes this claim on the basis of evidence is A, B, and C. How do we know that those approaches are applicable and appropriate and would generalize? And so then I ask about, has it been validated in other cases? And so, yeah, that's why I mention this, because it's a sort of thing that it's how I approach these things. And I'm trying to both argue from my point of view, but also show how I think about these things, which might be helpful to other people.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. From my understanding, this is used in courts all the time to kind of explain, okay, how would we expect the blood flow patterns to result given these wounds and stuff like that? We use it, and you can link articles of clothing that have certain blood stains to the victim and stuff like that, and say, yeah, this came from them. They must have been wearing it, or they can even conclude, like very specifics where they've taken off their top at the time this wound was enacted, or what position was the body in certain cases and stuff. So from my understanding, this is a well understood science. Yeah. So I think yes, they can, but I don't have a citation offhand.
So I was muted. Sorry about that. Let's do some more questions. Question for James. Do you plan on recording some new episodes of BA?
Oh, that's bad apologetic with Nathan. Short answer, yes. Long answer, we'll see when, but yes, it will happen. It's not really relevant to the debate, though.
No,
we do have a BA on the Shroud, so if you're interested, you can check that out.
I have to admit, that question, I'm glad you answered that, because that was killing me. I wanted to know the answer to that. So
all right, well, I'll keep highlighting some of these comments as they pop up, but I want to turn it over to both of you to kind of chat a little bit more with each other. So yeah, feel free to chat with. I have some more questions for both of you that I've put out. We could do those, or you all are welcome to chat with each other and give each other reflections on questions that you have that are unanswered that the other side hasn't talked about.
Yeah, I'm good. Whatever you want to do, whatever you think's best. You and James.
Why don't you ask each other a couple of questions, and then I have some questions for you as well.
Cool. You want to go first?
Sure. Okay. So I think the first of all, thank you for your rebuttal. I really appreciate it. And I am a little saddened that you weren't impressed with the details of my presentation, because I did want to do good and have a great debate kind of thing. So my apologies if you weren't impressed on that front. But there was something you mentioned that struck me about, so I have this thing called the minimal relevant features approach, right? And you've kind of said, well, look, I don't need to reproduce every single detail, and Dale is demanding I reproduce. So first of all, no, I'm not, right? I'm not demanding you reproduce every single detail. Like there are certain irrelevant features, irrelevant with respect to the image formation process. So I'm only asking for features which are inherent to the image formation process itself. So something like superficiality, where whatever created the images only did so on the top of the fibers, on the top primary cell. That's inherent to what kind of mechanisms would do it. Certain mechanisms would not produce that result. Other types of mechanisms do produce. And there's a reason, even Shroud skeptics like Luigi Garlascelli, why is he trying to reproduce these? If these features are all irrelevant. Photonegativity, three-dimensionality. Every Shroud skeptic in the world recognizes, okay, we've got to at least attempt to reproduce these as close as we can get to them. And it's because it's inherent to the image forming process. So they're not arbitrary, is my point.
I'm not sure that that's exactly a question, but I'll respond to that.
Yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, well, this is good because this is something I wanted to discuss. So one thing that you, so Gala Shelley, I think is interesting because he, in my view, shows how the nature of the image can be replicated without pigment, or at least without pigment being the cause of the image. He does use, obviously, that acid to originally produce it, but the image is not formed through a visible pigment, which is one of the important points that's interesting about the Shroud. The image is formed by differences in oxidative damage, which produce variations in the yellowing of the fibers, as we've both discussed. So that is, I agree, a feature that an account of the origins of the Shroud, how it was made, needs to be able to explain. How do we get that? Obviously, an account of the Shroud which said that it was painted just doesn't account for that, and so it's not, that would not be a good explanation. So I think we're in agreement there. But I think where we may differ is on exactly how far one needs to go with that. So I think one difference that you pointed out is that Gala Shelley's reproduction shows a larger number of, a greater depth of fibers affected by the discoloration compared to the Shroud of Turin. Is that a correct description of your concern about that?
Yeah, I think you answered what I was trying to ask, kind of thing, right? So yeah, I get where you're coming from. So
yeah, so the point is that we don't. It doesn't seem to me that that's crucial because a variety of different methods with subtle variations on exactly how exactly how the artist performed this will vary the amount of superficiality. And so to me, that doesn't seem essential. There's also the fact that obviously Gala Shelley's Shroud is not 700 years old and has been handled extensively. So that is also going to account for a difference there. So you may say, well, you still think that it's not, that his reproduction is not close enough and that there are still differences. My point of view is that there are always going to be differences. It's not clear that that there's an alternative explanation that better accounts for those features compared to say a Gala Shelley's or a similar technique. And it's not clear that those features are really that important. The important thing is, from my point of view, the important question is, how could a medieval artist have produced an image that's formed by discoloration in the yellow fibers such that it produces an image of an apparently crucified person? Gala Shelley shows that, in my view. He does not show how you exactly replicate the Shroud, but I don't see why those additional features are considered so essential as to mean that the skeptic has to account for exactly how those features came to be, whereas the Shroud proponent doesn't have to say anything about why those features came to be.
Well, it's because, so it's necessary because these are the key features of the Shroud, and we're trying to explain the Shroud's images. Now, okay, obviously there have been variations of techniques that produce certain minor variations in results, kind of thing, within a certain range. But for example, with the Gala Shelley technique, look, he's not the one who invented this. This goes back to Joe Nicol. He invented sort of a dry powder rubbing technique, and that's kind of spawned on Gala Shelley and later on Hugh Farey, who's improved upon Gala Shelley.
Yeah.
But from all of there have been dozens of experiments using these types of technique and looking at the variations in results. And what we find is that there is this inherent inability to even get close. So that the most up-to-date experiments using these kind of techniques, it's about 40 fibers thick into each thread is the amount of penetration. It would be even worse with Gala Shelley, who had this, this thick acid-bearing slurry compared to Hugh Farey. Hugh's tried to correct for that, but even his at best gets you 40. That's just not reproducing the Shroud at 2 to 4 fibers, and that's inherent. It seems to be inherent to the process from the various scientific experiments doing different. Okay, let me try this combination, and okay, let me try doing it with this aspect or this, and they all fail. So it seems to be inherent is the problem.
So this is interesting. How many people have attempted to produce a reproduction like this, do you think?
Yeah, so there's been Joe Nicol's experiments, and then subsequent to that, Stirp reproduced his, and then with various techniques using bas-reliefs in the 1990s and stuff like that. Garloschelli is kind of the most famous one who got kind of revived that technique. And since then, I would say Hugh Farey has done a series of experiments and published
I
those.
haven't seen. I'd be interested in having a look at the results of that. I don't think I've seen his.
Yeah, it's available on my. I'll send you the link. It's on my blog.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. But so the reason I ask about that is because I'm not sure I understand the criteria that you use for deciding what something is important. So, do you agree? I mean, this is a loaded question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you agree that regardless of whatever we do in terms of reproductions, there will always be some differences observable between a reproduction and the shroud? I presume you would agree with that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, obviously. Okay, so the question is, how do we decide what differences are sufficient such that that technique is not an explanatorily satisfactory explanation, does not provide an explanatory satisfactory explanation for the shroud, and differences which are not so consequential? And again, my question would be, I would seek to answer this broadly how we do through other historical artifacts. So what criteria do we use for establishing whether other historical artifacts can be explained by a certain technique? Now, to my knowledge, no one uses the approach that you seem to be advocating for, which is extremely high-level precision replication of arbitrary details. Arbitrary in the sense that people have only discovered all of these factors in the 20th century through careful forensic investigation. People didn't previously know about these. So I don't understand why you use that criteria. It seems to me that that is only used for the shroud or sort of similar artifacts.
Well, again, because only the shroud images are unique. We all agree. So only it.
No. Every historical artifact is unique, and each requires a different explanation as to the techniques that brought it about. I gave some examples of historical artifacts which are particularly hard to understand, but like Greek fire, we don't know how the Byzantines produced Greek fire, or the Antikythera mechanism. We can't reproduce those currently using techniques at the time. Now, do you think it's reasonable to infer that it was impossible that people made them using techniques at the time?
Okay, so sorry, I was going to answer your last
thing. Sorry, feel free. Ignore that question if you like. Sorry, I did jump a bit.
No problem. Yeah,
okay. I do have a comment from Teddy Pappas that I wanted to show because I don't want to get too far off before we.
Feel free to redirect if you like.
Again, it's gonna sound like repetition, but like we are able to discern what is inherent to the image formation process versus not. So here's something that's obviously not relevant. Right? I'll give you 3 examples. So here's something that's obviously not relevant. The Shroud Man has a forked beard. If Luigi Garloschelli produced a man and his statue just didn't, or his bas-relief just didn't happen to have a forked beard, but he still encodes the beard, I'm not going to be like, it's not a forked beard, therefore you haven't reproduced the shroud. That's irrelevant to the image forming process. Here's something that's possibly in the middle. Garloschelli even tried to reproduce the 1532 scorch wounds. Now, on one hand, you might say, well, that's totally irrelevant to image formation. On another hand, you say, well, maybe it is relevant to image formation because it relates to the composition of the images and the Walter McCrone studies and stuff like that. You know, are the images composed of paint or not? So maybe it is relevant, maybe it's not. It depends. Then there's the category of the minimal relevant features like superficiality or photonegativity. Like what you could ask the same, why are we trying to reproduce that? Who cares if you have a photonegative image or if it has 3-dimensional property? There's a reason that even shroud skeptics like Luigi Garloschelli recognize, okay, if I'm going to reproduce the shroud, I've got to account for these features. And it's because, you know, to repeat myself, it's inherent to how the images were formed, and that's what we're trying to answer.
So I do disagree with you here, Dale. So you use the phrase, it's inherent to how the image was formed. That doesn't answer the question. Technically, any detail that relates to how the image was formed through the causal processes is inherent to how the image was formed. Saying that it's inherent to how the image was formed does not allow us to distinguish which features are thought to be explanatorily important to replicate and those that are not. So you think it's explanatorily important to replicate the 4 fibers versus 40 fibers in terms of the depth of the discoloration. I do not really see how that's important and could easily be accounted for, in my view, by slightly different versions of the technique or aging of 700 years, which is very hard to replicate artificially. And it seems to be an extremely small detail that is supplementary to the issue of how do you discolor the fibers of the linen in a way that forms a pattern of a human, which we can do. So my question is, how do you decide, or how does a shroud proponent decide, which features are important to be able to describe naturalistically versus those that are not. And the supplementary to that is, how is that, whatever criteria you use, like how you decide, how does that relate to what we do in other cases of historical artifacts? Because I think we should be using the same processes that we use elsewhere to assess historical artifacts. And it seems to me that you're not using that process. You're using a very specific process tailored to make it impossible to explain the shroud.
Okay, well, so that's something, that was another thing I was going to ask you about, though, because you said, look, I'm just trying to exclude details and also set things up. So in the first place, I would just say, no, I'm not actually doing this. Now, I get in the debate why you would think I'm saying I'm just dismissing the historical evidence and or dating evidence as irrelevant. But
what
I'm trying to argue is that I think it's irrelevant unless and until you can prove, because it's your burden of proof here. It's a skeptical claim, right? You're claiming the shroud is medieval, therefore it can't be miraculous, right? That requires you to have that burden of proof. And I'm saying none of the reasons I've seen by skeptics work, right? So you haven't presented any reasons why the dating of the shroud would be significant. I can give an example.
I did, but I'd like you to answer my questions first, and then we can come back to the date question.
Okay, what's your question? How do I determine?
The question was, how do you oh, sorry, I think you were just going to say it. Yeah.
How do I determine what's inherently necessary, I should say, is I think what I meant, versus not. And
for an explanation, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's just because we know the results that certain mechanisms will produce that are inherently inconsistent with that. So all of the experiments using this bas relief technique, none of them ever get, in the variety of results gotten, get this result of 2 to 3 or 2 to 4.
Yeah, but that's not what I asked, Dale. I asked why we need to get that. And you're just telling me, but we haven't got that. And I'm asking what criteria that's used, say, elsewhere in art history or in archaeology are we applying that allows us to determine what features are important to explain and what not? And then you just keep saying, yeah, but it was 40 instead of 4.
But everything, when you have the necessary ingredients for something, like you mentioned Greek fire.
That's an example. We don't know how to reproduce Greek fire.
Yeah, but aren't there certain ingredients that are necessary described in the historical sources? Like
there are, but not enough detail for us to know exactly how to reproduce it. Same with the Antikythera mechanism. We still haven't been able to determine exactly how that was made.
Okay, but if you say I've reproduced Greek fire and you don't contain those minimal ingredients that are claimed to be necessary, then we know you haven't reproduced Greek fire, right?
Well, let me ask you a question. There are physical artifacts that we don't know how they were made with the technology at the time. Are there any physical things that exist that are artifacts that we cannot reproduce now with current technology?
Well, this goes to the whole crux of the debate. Depends who you ask. If you ask Dale, the shroud can't be reproduced. If you ask me, it can be. It depends on how you establish to use Dale's criteria. I think no historical artifact can be reproduced at all, because Dale doesn't have a criteria, in my opinion, about assessing what granularity is necessary for reproduction. And so there'll always be things you can find, even if those are things that are not evident to the naked eye, which I think contradicts his argument that it should just be based on what an ordinary person would think. So I think this is a tension in Dale's argument, which I mentioned previously. But if you don't have any criteria, then there's always going to be differences.
Well, can I ask you, James? Maybe it'll help me to see how you would answer this question, right? Like,
sure.
Certainly you think there are certain features that are inherently necessary to explaining the shroud images, right? You said it's got to produce oxidized cellulose. That's something you think is necessary. Would you say it's got to have these 3-dimensional properties that the shroud has, or is that irrelevant?
That's an interesting one. So I don't think you explained clearly what you mean by that. So let me explain how I understand that. Mm-hmm. The nature of the image as formed by graded discoloration of the superficial linen fibers, the cellulose and the superficial linen fibers, means that there will be 3-dimensional information encoded in that. Any image which has a gradation of color that's based on depth, where the gradation of color is based on the depth, or at least perceived depth from the viewer, will encode 3-dimensional image. So I don't really understand what the question even is here. That's one of the things that I like about Galascio's method, is that it necessarily gives rise to some 3-dimensional features because of the way that the coloration differs depending on the depth, and in his case, it like relates to the bas relief that he used for the face and so forth. Now, I know that it's not exactly the same as the depth information as in the original Shroud. That brings us back to our previous question.
Well, okay, but I'm just saying. So, in terms of the property itself, Walter Macron's traditional painting hypothesis, traditional painting are two-dimensional, inherently two-dimensional, right? Unless you're trying to reproduce three-dimensionality or something like that. So, traditional painting.
I don't think I agree with what you're saying, Dale, but maybe you can continue.
Oh, okay. So we can imagine certain mechanisms that would not produce the what we call the three-dimensional feature on the Shroud. You are saying, yes, that's necessary. That helps me. Okay, Luigi Garlashelli reproduces a sufficient amount of three-dimensionality, sufficient for you, kind of thing, and you go, that's good enough. But there are other methods that don't, so I rule those out. So I'm just wondering, like...
No, I haven't said that. All I've said is the way I understand... So all I have advocated for, let me be clear about the image production. I think that a theory of the image formation needs to explain how we get an image of a person, like a body, through discoloration, superficial discoloration of the cellulose in the linen fibers. That's really all I've said. Garlashelli shows that. Now, someone who said the Shroud was painted, that's just not going to work. It's not painted, right? That's very clear, and that's a totally different technique. As to the three-dimensional information aspect, some amount of three-dimensional information, it's, as I've understood how you use the term, is inherent in that process because there is a gradation of intensity based on the distance of the vertical distance. But there's a wide range of techniques that can produce that, and I think it really depends on exactly how you're defining three-dimensional information. So at that point, I start to be less clear about what the claim is.
Here's the question.
My question, this is it, and I'll go to you, Tavo, but my question is, like, how? Like, if you encounter a skeptic, because I've encountered skeptics like Pine Creek Doug or something, and they'll just deny, no, I don't have to account for any of the three-dimensionality, not even to you're arguing with me over degrees, fine, we can debate that. But what if you encounter a skeptic who says, you don't have to account for that at all? Just create images made of oxidized cellulose. That's all that's necessary.
What I'm saying is it seems that the process necessarily gives that information if you're to see a visualization of a face. I don't actually understand what an example of a face produced by this method, what an example of a face on a cloth produced by discoloration would be that didn't have 3D information, because it has to provide some information about the contours of the face, which is three-dimensional. So I guess I'm just not really understanding.
Well, like paintings, for example, they're fully two-dimensional.
Well, that's why I don't understand what you mean. What do you mean fully? So the cloth is two-dimensional as well. The Shroud, it's a cloth. So what do you mean a painting is fully two-dimensional, but the cloth isn't?
Yeah. So the darkness and lightness. Sorry, Tavo, I'll end after this. But the darkness and lightness of the color intensities correspond to depth information or topographical information. Distance.
But Dale, the photograph I'm looking at of your face right now has that as well. The shading of the light on your face is providing information about depth. What do you mean? No, it's not. Like, it is. Like,
it's an illusion. That's an illusion.
No, that's how we reconstruct depth information in the visual system. It's by using those sorts of cues. I don't understand how that's an illusion, but the Shroud one isn't. The Shroud one's more of an illusion because it cannot have been produced by just placing a cloth on the face, which we both agree on. So I think that, anyway, can I respond to your question before, Dale, about the dating? Because I think I don't think we're making any progress here. So you asked me why it's relevant that the Shroud dates to the 14th century. So I think I did answer this because there's a couple of reasons. One is that if my hypothesis is that the Shroud was produced by a medieval artist, then it should date to that period, right? The medieval artist hypothesis is not motivated by the carbon dating directly. It certainly precedes that. It's motivated by the techniques, like the stylistic aspects that I talked about, as well as the textual evidence. The fact that it carbon dates that period is independent evidence that's using an established, well-known, well-validated technique that strongly supports the hypothesis that it was made by a medieval artist around that time. Now, let's contrast that with the supernatural miracle explanation. As I've said, one of the problems with supernatural explanations is that they're, certainly with respect to God, is they're completely unconstrained because God's omnipotent. He can do anything. So of course God could make a miraculous shroud that carbon dates to the Middle Ages. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, it's relevant is because why would God make a miracle, that a miraculous object that carbon dates to the Middle Ages? It seems like God is just being deliberately confusing here, that he's making an artifact that is supposed to vindicate the miraculous resurrection of Jesus, but then when scientists test it, it looks like it was made in the Middle Ages. Why is God being so confusing? It doesn't seem to be a very good explanation, well explained under the supernatural account from my point of view. So that's why the two reasons why I think that the dating is relevant.
Gotcha. So yeah, that last one. So yeah, I outlined about 7 reasons that Shroud skeptics give. These are some of them as well. So in terms of, let me provide you with this, that the medieval miracle hypothesis could do. So, why would God perform a medieval miracle? It's a fair question and that sort of thing. And you think it's creating deceptions and stuff like that. So in the first place, I don't think it is creating deceptions with respect to dating, right? Then unless there's a little label and they're saying dated to 30 AD or something, then I think it's the medieval men that are responsible for their false assumptions. It's in the same way they made false assumptions about distant starlight. That's not on God. He isn't a deceiver because it takes distant starlight. They medievals would have thought, oh, I'm seeing the star as it exists today. But we know today, no, that it takes time. So you're seeing it as it existed in the past. Does that make God a deceiver? No, it's the fault of the medieval man. They made a hasty assumption. And that's the same with the shroud. There's no little label saying dated to 30 AD. As to the other things, that it's a deception that he would cover, it would have been a corpse wrapped normally with the shroud. Again, that I think that's an assumption that people are making, and perhaps it's even reasonable. But for medieval people, I don't think that God provided evidence for them that it was a miracle. I don't think a reasonable person living until up until 1978 could conclude the shroud was miraculous image. It was for us. And what is the purpose? Well, why would God do this? Is my own speculation. Here's my answer: is for every religion authenticating miracle serves 2 things. Number 1, it serves to authenticate the religion. And number 2, providentially, it leads to as many free-willed creatures as possible, achieving their ultimate purpose in creation. And it's that second thing that I would lean towards in answering stuff. So every miracle has to occur when, in the exact form they did, in order to achieve that end goal. That's my answer. Can I prove that that's true? No. But can you prove that's false? No. So that means it's equally probable.
No, Dale, that's not what that means. So I can't prove anything about God because it's so underspecified, but I can provide very convincing reasons to think that, for example, if instead of the shroud dating to the 14th century, it had been carbon dated to the 1st century, more people would have found it convincing. Many people already find it convincing, despite the fact that it doesn't radiocarbon date to the 1st century. It's incredibly reasonable, and I struggle to think of how anyone could deny this, that it would be more convincing if it dated to the 1st century than if it dated to the 14th century. Not to mention all of the other evidences that God could have provided, like appearing to different places or having the shroud appear in the Mesoamericas and things like that, that are just completely destroy any naturalistic hypothesis that I can come up with. God seems to be very modest in the sorts of evidentiary miracles he provides, where there's always these plausible naturalistic alternatives. Maybe it's so like, Dale, you should be telling me how there is a shroud that, in my opinion, you should be telling me how there's a shroud that dates to the 1st century in the Mesoamericas that shows all of these aspects from the biblical account, which have no plausible way of being accessed by people in the Americas. And I wouldn't know what to say about that. Instead, we're having the debate about whether the number of fibers that are discolored in the shroud is 4 or 40. Now, can you really tell me that the hypothetical Mesoamerican shroud would not be much more convincing than the shroud that we actually have?
So look, I think I would agree with you if the end goal was just getting right propositional beliefs, having the shroud date to the 1st century, not having any of this confusion. Why did God, as part of his miracle, he's given us confusing carbon-14 dating evidence that requires an explanation, right? So I would agree with you if that's the end goal. The problem is, from a Christian God perspective, and I'm sure in other religions, the end goal is not just right propositional beliefs. Demons have right propositional beliefs, but they don't achieve the end result. They dismiss it. So it's about getting people to that, achieving their ultimate purpose in creation, which involves perhaps right beliefs, but also, the right will, the right moral features and sanctification, everything that we call in justification and sanctification. And God would know in his omniscience that producing these miracles, even with these ambivalencies, produces that result. Whereas if he did it the way you did, maybe less souls would be saved.
So Dale, I understand that that's what you have to claim.
We have only about 5 more minutes in the free conversation. I'm happy to extend it, but I feel like I should ask first. But there are 2 fairly big topics that we haven't addressed at all.
Sure.
So I did put Juan from Modern Atheism. I put his question for Dale on the screen, but I kind of feel like we did address this quickly.
I think we just discussed that. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess we can move on. But I do want to highlight his channel. It's really fantastic.
Is God being deceptive, having the Shroud date to the Middle Ages was the question.
Okay.
Oh, I could put it back on the screen if there's anything else. Let me at least, because Dale, Juan has a really great channel and he asked you a question specifically. Is there anything else that Dale or James want to say about this briefly? I did want to move on to at least a couple of other things.
So let me briefly say, there's 2 things I wanted to say. One is that I think that the notion that the Shroud is meant to convince us as modern, late 20th century people who following the forensic investigations is inconsistent, Dale, with your initial articulation of the RAM account, which is supposed to just be convincing to an ordinary person. So I don't quite understand that. The second point that I wanted to make is just that, Dale, I know that your claim essentially has to be that God has arranged things providentially so that this extent of miracle and way of revealing the miracle maximizes the number of people who freely come to a relationship with him. I know you have to say that, but I don't see any reason for thinking that. And it seems that on the face of it, propositional knowledge about Jesus's divinity and resurrection is at least necessary. It's not sufficient, but God could have done a lot of a better job at producing that, it seems to me. And from my point of view, if it's acceptable to just say, well, I don't really know why God produced the Shroud with these features because it doesn't really seem to fit with what his ostensive purpose is, but at least we can just say, well, providentially, he must have known best. I, as a skeptic, can just say, I have no idea how the Shroud was produced, but it must have been produced by some unknown natural process. I don't think that's a very good response on the skeptic's point of view, but I'm saying I think it's on par with the response of the Shroud defender who just says, well, God must have had his reasons for doing it this way.
Well, it's again, especially within the Christian context, we know what the salvation requires not just right propositional beliefs, although that's necessary, but you need to obtain this conjunction of certain things. And I can tell you, man, thank God he gave us that erroneous carbon-14 dating. I've benefited. So many pro-Shroud guys will tell you they've benefited so much from it. Yes, it was a pain in the arse in the beginning, but the things we've learned from studying that and trying to get to an answer to that, God wants us to grow spiritually, intellectually. He wants us to investigate. These are traits that make someone's salvation fit and stuff like that. So I
what about the ordinary person responding to the Shroud by just saying, it seems to be the burial cloth of Jesus? That's I don't understand how that fits with what you're talking about of all the investigations.
So that was another point I wrote down to address. I think you don't understand what the reasonable person is, and maybe it's my fault. So you're right. It's not even necessarily what the ordinary people do or believe in reality. That's irrelevant. It's a hypothetical person. It's a normative standard. What the hypothetical average person ought to do in any given circumstances. And you gave the example in the medieval period. So there's, it depends on the circumstances you're in. People that didn't have reasonable persons living in 1960 didn't have the evidence from Sturp. I don't think the reasonable person would have concluded the Shroud images were miraculous just given the evidence in 1960. But that changes today now that we have this evidence. Maybe in the future, the reasonable person, God will give us evidence, let's say for the sake of argument, that the Shroud's fake. And I've misjudged here somehow. Okay, at that time, the reasonable person will go with whatever the evidence is. But for right now, I can trust that God is the guarantor as a real maximum great being, that I'm warranted in believing, given the evidence I'm privy to right now. That's why you don't have to care about, well, what about all the future unknown mechanisms? I'm not responsible for those. When we come to them, I'll come to them and evaluate that. But the reasonable person is a hypothetical person. It's not about what people do and ordinary people do in reality, and it's not a standard that's the same at all times.
Okay, so so just to clarify, so you're saying that the RAM account that you articulated is referring to someone who responds to the to the STURP evidence, like the forensics investigations, not just someone who sees the shroud, like, or even in a religious context, observes the shroud. You're saying it's someone who's looked at the forensic evidence.
Yeah, my goodness.
Okay.
I'm an ordinary person, and I can do basic research. You understand things as a scientist, as a neuroscientist, that I don't, but I can gain some basic common understanding if you're a good teacher and you present the evidence and stuff. So we're responsible to do the best we can as a real seeker. And here's an example. One thing you mentioned about this is a medieval guy thinking lightning or thunder. Aren't they a reasonable person in concluding, well, no, because again, one of my criteria, don't forget, is that it has to be a unique event to extraordinary contexts, kind of thing. And they see lightning happening at random times.
No, I actually said it's like it could be after they pray or some event of religious significance happens, and they would infer that must have been a divinely produced event.
Right, but wouldn't they also observe? So are you saying they see every time they pray, lightning happens? Or
no, it happened in a particular event that was of particular significance to them.
Yeah,
it's like spiritual religious significance in their
part of my RAM criteria. If they've even seen one occurrence where they're not praying or there's no religion authenticating context and lightning happens, then they're, as a reasonable person, they would know, okay, this isn't a miracle of God.
Well, not if there were differences, because
time. I do want to start interjecting more because I do want to
that's fine. Tom.
Yeah. And there are a few really great questions in the chat. Let me do this. Let me highlight this one. So actually, let me answer this question because there's a new paper.
This question makes no sense to me.
No, it doesn't make any sense to me too. But I was going to.
It's one of the worst arguments I've ever heard. Sorry.
No. But I think well, I'll get to that question in a second. But let me first say there was a paper that was published in just yesterday in Scientific Reports, and it was a DNA study on the Shroud of Turin. So people are asking about that in the chat. I'll just say briefly, I happened to peek at that paper last night. It doesn't really add anything to the conversation. It was a study on the DNA on the paper. I don't know if you guys want to comment on that or if you're familiar with it.
There's all sorts of DNA on the shroud from people who've handled it across a long period of time. I don't know.
Exactly, and that's what the paper shows. So it doesn't really conclusively change the conversation either way. In other words, it doesn't give us a time frame or an identity. I just thought I'd mention that because there's some people sounding off about it in the.
One thing I will say about DNA, so James is absolutely right. DNA studies are worthless on the shroud. As Barry Schwartz used to say, if you do a DNA study, I'll tell you what you'll find. Jesus was a middle-aged hippie with a ponytail, meaning because he left his own DNA all over that thing, right? But there are other DNA studies which may be more helpful. DNA of the textile itself, which some shroud scholars have said suggests a Middle Eastern or perhaps an Indian origin for the cloth itself. So there's that. But DNA of the shroud man, you can't conclude anything. It's going to be inconclusive.
Yeah, and I don't mean to bejorate the person who's asking this question. I think people already corrected that individual in the chat that a YY fetus would not be viable. But I think it does bring up a good question that I wanted to dovetail on. So I appreciate this individual for asking the question. And my question is this: if what is the certainty on both of your parts, to their degree of uncertainty or certainty, that we have actually found blood on the shroud? Because this was very complex in the STURP evidence, and you guys have talked about it briefly, but maybe it's sort of briefly mentioned in both your PowerPoints. We've touched on it briefly, but is there blood on the shroud? Yes or no? What's the certainty? And you can each answer individually.
Yeah. So go ahead, James.
Okay. Well, my answer is just probably. Well, actually, there's sort of two questions: is there blood, and is it human blood? But I say, there probably is human blood on the shroud. I don't have a particular issue with that.
Yeah, I think it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt. It's absolutely blood. There's no room for reasonable doubt there. As for it being human blood, no, we can't conclude that. And as for type AB, no, we can't conclude that as of now, in my understanding.
Femtone Molly says no DNA was found, but I think the problem was a lot of DNA was found, and it was just a bunch of junk that was probably from different people handling it and different contaminants. But
there's definitely DNA on the shroud, but you can't make anything of it.
Next question: we didn't talk at all about the crystallography data. Do you guys want to chat about that? This thing of like sugar sort of crystallography on the fibers, and that
I'm not too familiar with that.
You are. It's the wax dating is what he's talking
Oh,
about.
that.
WAXS, yeah. Yeah, it's from the Institute of Crystallography. It's not, the technique itself is not crystallography. It's this sort of radiographic.
Oh, right. Yeah, I
crystallographic.
don't really want to get into that at this point, to be honest.
Oh, okay, all right.
I mean, Dale, you can feel free to make a comment if you want to.
Yeah, I guess just briefly, and check out James. He's covered this in detail on his channel, and check out my channel where I've had Dr. Liberato De Caro responding directly to James and David Falk and a bunch of other skeptics on their criticisms. But essentially, what this is, basically, linen cloths will degrade in certain ways over time. And in this specific study, this X-ray dating or wax dating was conducted based on the, as Tal was talking about, the depolymerization. It sort of degrades over time in this certain way, and they can measure that using this wax scattering technique. And what they found is that, they had two conclusions in the paper that they found. Number one, I would argue it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt, given the data, that it's centuries older than the medieval period. It goes back to the ancient times. The second conclusion that everybody debates is, it dates specifically to the 1st century. That is still a little bit more controversial and stuff like that. But what I find most convincing, and I'll just leave it at this, is look, everyone gets into various problems and stuff like that with the study. It's a novel technique. James doesn't like the journal it's published in. I will just say Dr. Liberato De Caro referenced that. He has hundreds of publications in this field, including the Journal of Nature. So he knows this technology and how to use it for the past 30 years. But forget about interpretations or stuff like that. The raw data itself, it supports the 1st century date. It overlaps, the profile overlaps. I wish I had a picture to show you, but another 1st century cloth. And look, if this technique is totally incompetent and doesn't work, you wouldn't expect the raw data just by coincidence to correspond to a 1st century cloth. I find that coincidence is what kind of pushes me over the edge into going, there's something here. I believe this is probably a correct indication of the date of the shroud. It's not overly strong. We need to do more work. I agree with James there, but I think it's more probable than not.
Yeah, so I won't get into all the details. I did discuss them on my stream, but this is not a validated dating method. It's produced by someone who has a vested interest in publishing these sorts of papers, and they haven't validated against other methods. It's not been demonstrated by other labs. It's not been replicated. It's specifically developed to date the shroud, and so I don't really see any reason to find it convincing at all, not when we have a very well-established method that's been used to date the shroud by 3 independent labs that is an established and well-validated dating method. And I think that the issue here, Dale, with respect to the coincidence, is that you underappreciate the importance of research degrees of freedom. So these are methodological choices that the researcher makes throughout the study design process, through the application of the techniques, through the statistical analysis, and all sorts of other things that researchers can use to subtly, unconsciously or consciously, it can vary, affect the results. And this is a well-known problem throughout all of sciences, and is why I am very strongly in favor of only relying on techniques that have been validated, ideally by independent labs, and by not people who have a vested interest in a particular finding, and is why things like blinding and pre-registration of techniques are so important. And as one of the reasons why I'm very skeptical about many of the results that you present, Dale, is because I don't think they use good research methodology, and so are susceptible to these research degrees of freedom biases towards particular conclusions.
Well, do you all have any questions for me? Any questions you want to ask to me? I put some questions out, and I'm kind of curious. And think about that while you're thinking about that. I'll just say that I'm going through the questions that I have that I sent in an email to both of you. But I know I sent it pretty late last night, so you might not have seen it. Let's do this one.
One thing I never got to address the carbon-14 at all, just because my fault. I ran out of time. But do you want me to give my take on that, or?
Sure. Let's do that. I think that'll be really critical for people. Go ahead.
Okay, so James mentions about the 1988 carbon-14 dating, and I honestly think this is a little bit of a double standard on him, because on my end, I can admit about certain aspects that are problematic with the wax dating. It is a novel technique. It does need test. It does need further collaboration and blind testing. They didn't do a blind test, but on the same token, the carbon-14 wasn't blind either. So there are a whole host of problems with the carbon-14 dating that have been documented and isn't deniable. But let me just for the very quickly. So, for example, even today, the dating of textiles in 1988 is specifically was a known problem at that time that should cause us to have doubts. The method was only about 10 years old at the time, and carbon-14 scientists themselves had grave concerns about the dating of the shroud using this technique. So, first of all, in terms of textiles, even to this day, Beta Analytics, the top carbon-14 lab in the entire world, or one of the top labs in the world, Beta Analytics still has a warning specifically for textiles, not for any other type of material, only for textiles, that they will not carbon-14 date a textile unless it's part of a multidisciplinary study, meaning they need non-carbon-14 evidence to help rely upon. They won't even touch it to do a carbon-14 test unless you have that. Secondly, even in the 1980s, there were various peer-reviewed studies, things in like the Radiocarbon Journal. That's not a false journal. That's the top carbon-14 scientists publish in the world. And they published various studies, one of which, I'm just trying to find it, was I can't, so I can't find it. So I'll just go based on memory. But Dr. Murdoch Baxter studied 38 carbon-14 labs. The final conclusion, and sorry to just give you the conclusion, James, but that's all I remember off my head, is only 7 of the 38 labs produced results that were satisfactory. And of these labs, only 5 were AMS, because AMS was only 10 years old at the time. A whopping, statistically significant 40% of those AMS labs failed the systematic bias criterion for the test. And when you go to Bob Ruck, and what is the problem with the 1988 carbon-14 dating? It's due to this provable systematic bias. And that's what's been published since 2017. And James acknowledges there is this systematic bias. We can dispute what that is. Is it due to pre-cleaning differences? Is it due to neutron radiation? But nonetheless, it's just a coincidence that in 1989, this study, Dr. Murdoch Baxter said, yeah, the AMS labs were terrible, the 40% failure rate, and they failed specifically on the systematic bias criterion. And then in 1988, that's the specific aspect where that's problematic that we've discovered.
I'll just respond briefly to a few of those points. The variance between the labs, as I discussed in my initial presentation, is unfortunate. It would have been better to standardize the protocols. On the other hand, we can see these as 3 independent replications of the dating. I don't find that the notion that this presents I don't think that this really undermines the 14th century dating. All of them date to the same period. The difference is about 90 years, which, given that we're trying to distinguish between a 14th-ish century date and a 1st century date, is not statistically relevant. And the other point, though, is, as I showed in the slides, is that the same labs also correctly dated 3 other textiles with known provenances. But somehow the proponents of the shroud never talk about these, and it's only the dating of the shroud that's supposed to have been incorrect, not the 3 correctly dated other textiles. Also, I'm not really sure what you're talking about, Dale, with respect to the difficulty with dating textiles. There's hundreds of papers about radiocarbon dating of textiles. It's a widely used technique in archaeology. I don't know exactly what the 40% criteria you were talking about refers to, so I won't comment on that. But I mean, I agree that there is a need to use methodologically rigorous approaches as best as we can. There are some issues with the shroud, mainly because different cleaning techniques are used with the shroud dating. But to say that this undermines the conclusion that they're late medieval, I think is incorrect. None of the errors get close to pushing it back to the 1st century. It was independently replicated 3 times. Those labs successfully dated 3 other textiles. So I don't think that the concerns warrant just ignoring or significantly dismissing the carbon date, which, to be fair, Dale, you haven't actually done, because you're not saying the carbon date is wrong. So that's one of the reasons that I don't want to push too hard on that, but that's why I find the carbon dating much more convincing than the other methods, which have not been validated in the same way as this technique. And by the way, though, I will say I would love the shroud to be carbon dated again. That would be nice to have even more evidence, but I wouldn't expect a significantly different result.
The only issue I would say is that in the 1980s, there were various studies in the peer-reviewed literature where the control, I don't think they did 3 in this study I'm remembering. It was 2, but they got the correct dates for the control samples, but they were off by more than half the known age for the sample proper kind of thing. And these are, again, in studies from the 1980s about AMS labs and stuff like that. And again, I've got all the papers on my blog, so I'll find those and post them up when I post this show on my my channel.
Well, I have a few questions. We are over time, so I want to be respectful.
Yeah, I should probably be finishing up soon, but we can do maybe 1 or 2 questions, then I'll have to go.
Well, let's do this one because I still want to reserve at least 10 minutes for closing statements. All right. Why don't we do this? I'd like you both to maybe pick what you think is the strongest or most confounding factoid on the other side of the debate. Maybe we talk about that, and let's do James first, and then Dale.
The most interesting thing about the Shroud, from my point of view, is that I'm not aware of other depictions of a crucified Jesus that use a similar technique. There may have been some either that didn't survive or just I'm not aware of, but it does seem to be relatively unusual. So that's certainly compelling. Now, does that point to a supernatural origin? I don't think it does, but it's, I think, one of the reasons the Shroud has received quite a lot of attention.
Dale, same question to you. What's the most compelling fact on the other side of the fence?
The most compelling fact. It's interesting, yeah, because I split Shroud studies up into the miraculous authenticity and the historical authenticity. So I might answer differently depending on what is there. But yeah, I guess the most confounding thing for me, I guess, is again, I found a solution to it. But at the time of my conversion, I actually thought, so this kind of disproves one of James' claims, because at the time of my conversion, my criteria exposed a natural mechanism that worked, that fully explained the Shroud images. And because of that, I didn't convert on the basis of a mechanistic type argument. So this was Dan Spicer and E.T. Totten's electric charge separation mechanism. And that was the most confounding to me, because at the time of my conversion, okay, this ticked off all the boxes in terms of my minimal relevant features. It seemed to explain them and be equally probable. So therefore, I couldn't support a claim to know that a miracle happened. So since then, more research has come out, and I've learned more about the technique. And so there are problems. So again, it now fails. But at the time, that was the most confounding thing to me, that specific mechanism.
All right, next question, and then we'll go to closing statements. You know, I find that wading through a lot of this very densely evidentiary argumentation is quite challenging. What's the one succinct statement that you would make to support your case to somebody from the lay audience? There's a lot of people on the chat who are very well versed in a lot of these issues, but many people watching the chat are probably like really lay audience members. What would you say to them that's an easily grasped piece of evidence that leads to an easily grasped conclusion that doesn't require months of research or really diving into the literature to verify a lot of this information? Let's start with Dale this time.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess if I were to put it in a nutshell, I would say the Shroud images currently are, and this is uncontroversial, they are currently unexplained or unexplainable, and they're entirely unique, despite decades of various experiments and attempts to duplicate these images. This indicates this indicates something more is going on. I guess that's what I would say to somebody just to get them started.
James,
well, as for my answer, I think that the short one, which is honestly convincing to most people, it seems to be, is that the Shroud of Turin appears in the historical record in the 14th century. It carbon dates to the 14th century, and it shows artistic hallmarks of late Gothic art. That's more than enough reason to think that it dates from that time and was produced as a relic, like many others at the time, and it is not, in fact, a first century burial cloth of Jesus.
Well, let's turn it over to closing statements then. And let me go first and just say This has been a really wonderful conversation. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm so glad that you both are here. And I really hope seriously that every person who's watching right now will take me up on my advice that they subscribe to both of your channels, which are both really fantastic. So closing statements, I can't remember where we are in terms of the order of who's going first, but
well, Dale should go first because he went first in there.
Okay, yeah, that's reasonable. Yeah, okay, go ahead, Dale, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, yeah, thank you to Tavo and James for doing this debate. I think it was really important. And I always have a great time with James. I think he's a very smart, knowledgeable skeptic who does his research. He's willing to do homework, for crying out loud, which is very rare, and debate these important topics and stuff like that. So I always appreciate that. I could tell he was a little disappointed. He was a little disappointed with my answer to why these MRFs and not that. I wish I had an answer that was more convincing to him, but that is my answer, and I think that's how most people, including Luigi Garlascelli, would answer. That there's a reason they felt they had to reproduce these certain features to these degrees. So on that front, I presented, look, what are the general criteria for rationally and a reasonable person to rationally infer a miracle? And on that front, I think that my criteria are grounded in a valid inference from intelligent design. They do correspond to specified complexity. Again, maybe just due to time, but I didn't hear any objections to James about intelligent design theory and the use of specified complexity as the underlying justification for my religion authenticating miracle criteria. It was more aimed at my criteria for miracles specifically. I don't think his criticisms are not true. If I had a chance to explain, I'm not just arbitrarily eliminating things where I'm just dismissing things. No, there are ways that these criteria can be easily fulfilled by the other side. And as I said, at the time of my conversion, there was a natural theory that did fulfill it. And guess what? I didn't believe on the basis of a mechanistic argument. So that should be proof enough, if you think I'm honest, that actually there are ways to falsify the miracle hypothesis here. Now, in terms of the shroud itself, we covered various topics. I think that my underlying point that I want to get across here is that there's this thing in philosophy called the principle of indifference. And if the evidence or reasons don't warrant one way or the other, we need to be indifferent to those two hypotheses. And it's on that front, I think I've met my burden of proof to push us over into saying, yes, the shroud images fulfill these religious authenticating miracle criteria, and these themselves are rational. Or at the very least, my standard was that one reasonable person could come to the belief that this was a miracle on that basis rationally. And I think I've established that. And, so that means either God is allowing for undue confusion, something that is logically impossible given his definition as a real maximum great being, or I'm rational in believing the shroud images were miraculously formed. And I go for the latter, and I think you should too. The evidence points in that direction. Everything on James's side, I think, could be at best what I was aiming to do was present enough defeaters or undercutting defeaters to get us back to the principle of indifference. There's nothing that pushes us to say probably the shroud images are fake, kind of thing. So in the absence of anything on the negative side, and I think my presenting a positive case, we have reason to say, yeah, the shroud images are miraculous. So thank you very much. You can tell I just made that up on the spot, but
No, that was great. All right, James, go ahead.
Well, thanks very much, Tavo, for inviting us. Thanks very much, Dale, for participating. And I do appreciate your honest engagement, and I find you much easier to talk to than some Christians I've dialogued with in the past. And I don't want to imply that I think you're intellectually dishonest or any of these sorts of things, as much as I may disagree with some of your conclusions and object to some of the finer points. Let me just summarize at the end here how I think about the issue. So the Shroud of Turin, most obviously and straightforwardly, presents itself. It purports to be visually, it depicts a it depicts itself as a burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth immediately after his crucifixion. My view is that the best explanation for the shroud, its artistic features and a variety of other factors such as the historical sources and so forth, is that it was the product of a late medieval artisan. Whether they produced it as a devotional icon or as a deliberate forgery, I don't know. But I think that this hypothesis accounts best for the evidences that have been discussed today. So one of those is the artistic features of the shroud, which indicate that it was a product of late medieval artistic features of the elongated limbs and the positioning of the hands over the groin, which is not really well accounted for by a divine miracle. It's not really clear why God would make it look like that. The fact that the shroud itself purports to be a burial cloth of Jesus, yet it's impossible to form an image of a face in the way that the shroud shows by just placing a cloth on a face. So God could, of course, still have created the image to look like it was what you might think a burial cloth would be. But I think that that's a poor explanation, because it seems to be putting God in the position of some sort of a recreator or reenactor, rather than who's making a deceptive artifact that purports to be something that it actually isn't. A similar point arises with the radiocarbon dating, which is independent evidence of a 14th century origination, alongside the textual evidence and the artistic evidence. All of which are best explained by the late medieval artisan theory, and are not credibly accounted for by any supernatural hypothesis. It's very unclear why God would create the shroud specifically, as Dale has said, as evidence for the 20th century audience, but also make it so that the best and most reliable dating method that we have shows it to be medieval. The purported purpose of the shroud, according to the proponent, is that it was created by God as a divine vindication of Jesus's divine status. This provides a poor explanation for its very existence, because it's not very convincing evidence of that. It doesn't have anything directly to say about the resurrection. Much more convincing would be Jesus simply appearing to people around the world and having this documented, or even the shroud appearing in the 1st century in the Mesoamericas, as example I gave. There's many examples one could construct of evidences that would be far more convincing to people at the time and to us moderns of a vindicatory miracle of Christ's divine status. Now, of course, mere belief is not sufficient to attain salvation, which is God's ultimate objective, as Dale has said. But I think it's important to understand that it's at least necessary. And so if God is in the business of producing miraculous objects, it seems very hard to understand why he then makes them so underwhelmingly convincing compared to what they could be. Likewise, the supernatural hypothesis doesn't explain the other features that I mentioned, the artistic features, the fact that there's no textual evidence connecting the shroud to the 1st century, and the radiocarbon dating. I've also talked about how I think that Dale's approach to the shroud, looking at some of the specifics, lacks justification in terms of how we approach other historical artifacts. His criteria seem to make it impossible, that the RAM criteria make it impossible to bring contradictory evidence to light, and means that he does not have to provide any supernatural explanation that accounts for the phenomena. All that Dale has really argued is that there are various specific features of the shroud that cannot be precisely duplicated by modern techniques. I don't think that there's any basis for requiring this in order to account for the origins of a historical artifact. It seems to me to be an ad hoc requirement. The specific issues with, say, the depth of the penetration of the discoloration of the images and other facts that were brought up at different times is hard to debate without going through all the details. But one of my major concerns is that many of the papers that Dale has referenced are produced by people who make a career out of publishing these results to vindicate the shroud, and are not based on methods that are generalized or validated against other techniques, which the radiocarbon dating was, despite some issues with the pre-cleaning method. So this is coming to this as a skeptic, I find that a lot of the pro-shroud literature is very motivated and does not use methodology that seems to be validated in other contexts. It seems very precisely developed and tailored to specifically validate the shroud, and to make any criticisms impossible. And so that's why, as a skeptic, it seems to me that the reasonable approach is to think that the shroud is exactly what the carbon dating and the artistic and textual evidence says it is a product of the late medieval period, and not a 1st century miracle that at the same time is not very convincing as a miracle. Thanks very much, Tavo and Dale, for your time.
Well, great job to both of you. I want to underscore that if you guys want to see more debates on this channel, I'd be happy to moderate and host more of them Teddy Pappas, if you've sounded off with some really insightful points in the chat. So if you ever, that's our just the timer going off. Let me just dismiss that. So Teddy, if you ever wanted to be on this channel for anything, I'd love to do a Talking with Tavo thing with you. Similar invitation to you, James. If you ever want to pop up to the channel, I would love that. We could talk about anything you like, any topic of your choosing. Same thing to Dale. I've been on your channel a couple of times, but I'm always happy to do stuff on your channel again. With that, I'll respect our speaker's time and go ahead and close the live stream. But thanks to all of you for participating.
Thanks everyone.
To everyone for the really wonderful conversation. And I really hope that all of you have a wonderful day.
God bless. All right, so that's the debate. Like I said, it went really well. I hope you guys enjoyed it and were edified from both my and James's takes and points, and it gave you stuff to consider and think about. Now, I want to get to my post-debate review on James Fodor's rebuttal against my RAM identifying criteria.
So I want to discuss the religion authenticating miracles framework that Dale introduced in his initial slides. So the core idea here is that come back to that. The core idea seems to be here that the criteria are satisfied when there is an independently given religious context, and that within that context there is some event, or in this case an artifact, which arises that is extraordinary to an ordinary person, like not requiring a lot of expertise, and that in the context, viewed in the context of that extraordinary event or artifact and the independent religious context, we can infer that or at least a reasonable person can infer that the extraordinary event, in this case the shroud, is a divine vindication of that religious context. In this case, it would be the resurrection of Jesus. So hopefully I've appropriately summarized that idea here. Now,
and just to clarify, so I saw some commenters on James's channel with some confusion over the definition of a reasonable person and whether it was a legal definition or not. It is indeed a civil legal definition that I was using. And the person I was saying quoted me correctly as I defined it, right? It's a hypothetical person, what a reasonable person hypothetically ought to do, believe, say, think in a given situation, given the relevant circumstances that applied. That is a legal definition. And again, I defined it in my slides kind of thing as to exactly the precise wording of the definition. Now, one thing I just want to clarify here is that, again, because I was preparing for a debate, I had to simplify and water down things, fit into a 20-minute presentation without getting into what I saw as tangential aspects and stuff like that. But one thing that's important in my full argumentation regarding religion authenticating miracles and how those authenticate Christianity and versus other religions as the religion that God endorses either as true or as the religion that we ought to follow. Now, on that front, I really target not just the reasonable person, but in my actual argumentation, if I were being fully correct, it would be a reasonable real seeker as the standard. And obviously I kept off the real seeker element because it brings up other theological aspects. So a real seeker, as I define it, is you have to be, criterion one, sincerely open-minded, not just pretend or say that you're open-minded to the evidence, when in reality, I find with a lot of online skeptics, they're the most closed-minded people in the world. They pretend they're open-minded, but they're not. So you have to be sincerely open-minded. You have to be actively seeking, to the best of your ability, the religious truth in this case, and whether it's a miracle. And finally, you're willing to obey or to submit to the religion or that truth once discovered in whatever way is appropriate. So that's how you be a real seeker. And I just add in the civil law definition, reasonable real seeker.
Appropriately summarize that idea here. Now, what I want to articulate here is that from my perspective, and I mean, I think this should be reasonably clear to someone who is not necessarily a proponent of the shroud, these criteria are designed to make it impossible to demonstrate that the shroud does not have a divine origin. The criteria have a number of features that mean that it's only possible to provide evidence in favor of the Shroud and impossible to provide evidence that the Shroud is a human artifact.
So this first part is demonstrably false. And I'm really shocked at how people are picking up on this is not true at all. Listen to what he said. It's impossible. It's not even possible to conclude anything other than a miracle took place. And it's designed to say the Shroud in particular has to be a miracle. It's not even possible to conclude something is not a miracle or that the Shroud is not miraculous using these criteria. Well, that's utterly false. And I've proven that over and over and over again in my own life. So in the show, I with respect to the Shroud, these criteria were created before I was ever a Christian, before I believed in the Shroud. These were not just made up on the spot to do a debate with you. And I have proof on that on my channel where I do like 4-hour shows, 5-hour shows on these religion authenticating miracle criteria. So there's video proof out there that I didn't just invent these for the debate. And there's proof through my testimony, at least, that I developed this criteria as a non-Christian believer, someone who is just a believer in God, a theistic God, but I was non-religious. And I was doing my religious research, trying to find a way to evaluate which religion, if any, is endorsed by God. At that time, I didn't care about truth. I was open to the possibility that, well, maybe God could use a false religion to allow me to achieve my ultimate purpose in creation. So all I was trying to prove is that these religion authenticating miracles are religion authenticating in the sense that God endorses me or human beings following this religion and obeying it, at least at this given time, in order to achieve our ultimate purpose in creation, regardless of whether or not it's true or false. Obviously, from the definition of God as a real maximum great being, I think I could provide additional supplemental argumentation that, well, if he endorses it, it must also be true. But for the purposes of my argument, I didn't even bother going there. Maybe it's false, but we still need to God endorses it and wants us to follow it. And he gives it a religion authenticating miracle saying, hey, humans, be Christians and you'll achieve your ultimate purpose. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false. Outside of that, look, no, it was actually possible. And I did conclude that the Shroud was not miraculous on a mechanistic. One of my sub-criteria for extraordinariness is that all well-known or well-established to the reasonable person or to the reasonable real seeker, if I'm being technically correct, would be deemed to be improbable. And guess what? The Shroud of Turin, at the time of my conversion on May 5th, 2018, and for years afterwards, failed that criterion. Therefore, it's obviously possible because I did conclude, well, the Shroud is not proven to be miraculous, at least on a mechanistic level. And that's how basically everybody else in the pro-Shroud field argues. They argue for radiation is the best explanation. They argue, abductively that some kind of corona discharge or supernatural miracle, or as Teddy does, or infusing life energy or resurrection energy, which I won't get into an evaluation of that. But anyways, that's how they typically pro-Shroud guys will always argue mechanistically. And yet I said it failed. So obviously it wasn't designed to be impossible to say that it failed. Now, obviously I did convert based on the Shroud because there was a secondary criterion, the uniqueness despite sufficient opportunity for duplication in a naturalistic context, and the Shroud passed that criterion. And there was a circumstantial argument, so I kind of went on that basis. The point is, I've evaluated many miracles, every miracle in all the major world religions, including other Christian miracles, and they've failed, proving it's possible to fail the religion authenticating miracles and say, no, a natural explanation is at the very least equally probable or equally likely to explain the fact. And given the principle of difference, that means I can't claim a miracle. If you want examples, let's look at Islam. November and December of 2017, I almost became a Muslim. I used these criteria, and under these criteria, it looked like the evidence for the resurrection could be subsumable to Islam, because I was being convinced by, number one, that the death and resurrection was not contradictory to the Quran. These are my criteria for subsumability, which I didn't get to in the debate. And secondly, Islam had what looked to be an independent religion authenticating miracle attesting to it. What was this? The numerical or math patterns in the Quran, specific subset of them, these symmetrical things. For a couple of months, I was almost persuaded, yeah, these are religion authenticating miracles. They fulfill my criteria. And I almost went for Islam. But then I did my third round of study, as I do for all the miracles I studied, and it failed. I realized it failed because they weren't being able to prove extraordinariness criterion. So yeah, it's obviously possible. Well, what about with Christianity? Well, there are miracle claims that people make. For example, the argument from fulfilled prophecy was some biblical prophecy, oracles to the nations. I studied that, man, in depth. And this was a key feature as to why I lost my faith as a Christian, was failed prophecies and stuff like that. Specifically, the prophecy to Tyre in Ezekiel was very problematic to me at the time. I left the Christian faith around 2009, 2010. And so I studied the case for biblical prophecies. And in the end, I studied it according to my religion authenticating miracle criteria. Guess what? They failed. How is that even possible? According to James, these are designed to make it impossible. And yet it was clearly possible in my own life. I proved James's statement is wrong. It's a lie. It's false. It's absolute bunk. And at one point, James himself even gives an example of medieval people thinking lightning and thunder. These could easily pass through religion authenticating miracles, and you have to think it's a miracle. No, they don't. Because remember, there are two criteria. Number one, there's the uniqueness falsification criterion. The event has to be unique to extraordinary contexts. Secondly, it has to be proven to be extraordinary on the basis of the three criteria. James only covers the second criterion, and he hypothesizes, falsely I might add, but just for simplicity's sake, let's say he's right, that, it could fulfill the criterion. If the standard is only this reasonable person, or technically speaking, a reasonable real seeker, well, I could picture a medieval reasonable real seeker or a reasonable person thinking thunder and lightning. He's praying one night and thunder happens. So it's got your little religious context. It's got your lightning happening. Okay. He thinks that's a miracle. Oh, but you forgot the second necessary criterion, unique to extraordinary contexts only. And every medieval person in the world would have witnessed multiple times in their life. Most of the times lightning and thunder occurs, it's not within a religious authenticating context. It happens, it's just the artifact of our natural world. Yeah, when it rains, sometimes there's thunder and lightning. It just happens at times. And the failure of that criterion alone it's not a miracle. Proving once again, it is possible for these criteria to be applied and not to come away proving the conclusion that a given event is a miracle. You're just wrong here, James. And I don't think you gave my criteria a fair shake. And I'm not critiquing you personally for that because, again, you had one day to prepare your rebuttal and you don't have the necessary background knowledge or full understanding, which I couldn't present in a 20-minute presentation, and of my criteria, how I apply them, how they're used, and that sort of thing. So, yeah, on that front, you're just wrong. It's absolutely provably possible, 100%, unless you think I'm lying about my own experience, which you admit at the debate that I'm not intellectually dishonest. So I'm testifying to you. It is possible for a given event, miracle claim, to fail these criteria, and therefore us to reason that it either is natural or at the very least to go, I'm agnostic. Maybe it's a miracle, maybe it's not. Another example, one last example to proving it's possible. Our mutual friend, Caleb Jackson, he comes to me with these miracle claims, religion authenticating miracles from miracle healings. I've applied my criteria, and in this case, I actually agree with him that it's extraordinary in some of his cases, but it's the specification criterion, the religion authenticating context criterion, that I think it fails. And for that basis, I think that miracle healings, sometimes supernatural miracle healings happen, but they're not religion authenticating miracles. Instead, they're miracles of compassion. And it's precisely because, I'm applying under the specification, my religion authenticating context criterion. And I think these miracle healings that Caleb talks about fail that criterion. And that's why I don't believe miracle healings are religion authenticating miracles, at least in terms of modern miracle healings. But how is that possible? According to James, it's impossible that I can conclude any event, every single event I plug in here, and if I apply these criteria, it should come out as being a miracle. Obviously, that's not true. So, okay, let's continue on with his next objection.
So, in particular, the RAM criteria do not, at least as Dale articulated them, and he can, of course, feel free to provide further clarification later, that they do not allow for any contradictory evidence. And we've seen this. We've seen how Dale shrugs off the 14th century dating of the Shroud using the radiocarbon dating as simply being irrelevant to his criteria, because it actually, none of the criteria require that there be a balancing of evidences of whether of those that support a miraculous origin for the Shroud against those that don't. And so any evidence that's presented is simply ignored because that's not one of the criteria. The criteria is just, is there an independent religious context, and does the Shroud appear extraordinary to an ordinary person? So all contrary evidence can be essentially ignored.
Okay, so I addressed this in the debate as well. Let me say this. So what we have to ask is the evidence, if a given event, whatever it is, the Shroud image formation, or, whatever miracle claim you want to evaluate, the Muhammad splitting the moon in half, or anything, right? Does a given event fulfill the religion authenticating criteria? And are these criteria sufficient to justify that this is, in fact, a religion authenticating miracle? Now, James obviously would say, no, it's not sufficient. I would argue it is sufficient. Look, these criteria alone are sufficient to conclude a miracle has happened. Am I excluding evidence? Are the criteria, religion authenticating miracle criteria, excluding evidence? No, I'm just doing what every logician should be doing, in categorizing evidence as either relevant to the main or irrelevant. With respect to what? With respect to the main question, hypothesis, that, this is a religion authenticating miraculous event. On that front, my claim in my opening presentation is that I have no reason to believe that the dating of the Shroud images, or even its anatomical accuracy, or even its historical accuracy, those are all irrelevant to the question of ascertaining whether it's a religion authenticating miracle or not. The formation of those images are a religion authenticating miracle or not. Or at the very least, I think I could establish that they're unnecessary as the default position. Now, certainly atheists and skeptics, Shroud skeptics, love to mention this in reverse, right? They love to say, and I'm sure James would also argue this as well, even if we could prove the Shroud goes back all the way to 30 AD and is dated into the 1st century, that still doesn't prove it's gold. That's irrelevant. Who cares? Maybe it's just a 1st century artistic fake. Maybe it's 1st century naturally created Shroud image, but it has nothing to do with the historical Jesus, and or even if it did cover the historical Jesus, that doesn't prove it's a miracle. Atheists and Shroud skeptics love to recognize this point when it benefits them. But you have to be consistent here, James, because the reverse is also true unless and until you prove your skeptical claim. You are the skeptic. You're claiming to prove not only that the Shroud is medieval, and if the Shroud is not 1st century and or medieval specifically, then that proves they can't be a miracle. Says who? I'm not going to just accept the truth of that premise without sufficient warrant or due reason for it. And to James's credit, he does present what he considers two reasons. I only think he only provides one possible reason, and I quickly defeat that reason, leaving us therefore maintaining that, yeah, it's totally unnecessary component and it's irrelevant to the question of whether the shroud images are miraculously formed or not. Just before we get into James's two reasons for why he thinks the dating is relevant to the miraculous image formation question, let's pretend James succeeds for the moment. Let's pretend some skeptic does finally provide a genuine sound reason or logically sound reason for believing that the dating of the shroud and or the anatomical inaccuracies of the shroud and or the claimed historical inaccuracies of the shroud is indeed relevant to the image formation question and whether or not they are miraculous. Let's just, for the sake of argument, say that James succeeds. Is it true then that my criteria are just incapable of taking into account this negative evidence, so to speak? And on this front, I have to admit that for the purposes of the debate, James is actually correct on this, because the criteria as I laid them out with just my three criteria: prove the event happened, prove it's extraordinary in one of three ways, and or prove there's a specification or a religion authenticating context, whereby the miracle serves to authenticate the religion and it's not subsumable by any other religions. That alone, okay, well, where would I fit the historical and the dating of the shroud, for example, if that was relevant into that? And it doesn't fit into those criteria. All three of those criteria could be fulfilled, thus triggering the miracle inference, and we would have this leftover residual of, yeah, but the shroud is medieval, and if it's medieval, it's probably not a miracle. How do you account for that data? Because you can't fit that into the criteria. So here's where, look, it does fit into my criteria because I have a fourth criterion that I didn't include in the debate for simplicity's sake. And it's basically saying, and God doesn't provide any further clarifying mechanisms. So the dating of the shroud, historical inaccuracies, anatomical inaccuracies, if these counter features are relevant, they would be included in as further clarifying mechanisms and count as negative evidence, where I would plug that into Bayes' theorem and get overall, how convinced am I that it's a miracle based on the first three criteria versus how convinced am I it's not a miracle based on these further clarifying mechanisms. And going forward, I will make a note to include that. But originally, I had this as part of my 11 premise argument, right? Premise 1, God exists in the first place. So this what I presented in the show is only part of my premise 8 in an 11 premise argument. I made that, it's not a good argument. It's not logically valid or anything, but it just sort of outlines my take from before I was a professional philosopher. Since then, I've updated it and I've actually made the argument logically valid. And I present that in my Reason and Theology podcast where I give my personal testimony and that sort of thing. But out of the original things, premise 8 would be my religion authenticating miracle criteria. Then in premise 9, I have, and there are no further clarifying mechanisms. So that's where I would update that and say, okay, look, there are further clarifying mechanisms relevant to premise 9, but also as a fourth criterion in premise 8. For the religion authenticating miracle criteria, I would add a fourth criterion that there are no further clarifying mechanisms with respect to whether the event in question is, in fact, a religion authenticating miracle. And that's where I could deal with any and all negative evidences against that. Things like, a reasonable person should be waiting for any and all unknown future mechanisms, or another for, dating of the shroud in the case of the Shroud of Turin, or whatever. So that's where I would include any relevant negative evidences or counter evidences and features is in the further clarifying mechanism no further clarifying mechanisms criteria, because obviously if there are further clarifying mechanisms proven to a sufficient degree, that could overwhelm any and all positive evidence from the first three criteria, and I would have to conclude it's probably not a religion authenticating miracle. It's not true. James is not able to prove that the shroud is in fact medieval, let alone that it's relevant, that there are anatomical inaccuracies, let alone that it's relevant. And or he didn't present any historical inaccuracies, I don't think either, let alone that those are relevant. And all of those can be defeated. The shroud is not medieval. It probably covered Jesus' corpse, but even if it were medieval, that's irrelevant. Same for all the other things. That's what I was arguing. There are no historical inaccuracies on the shroud, but even if there were, it would be irrelevant. There are no anatomical inaccuracies on the shroud, but even if there were, they would be irrelevant. And anatomical inaccuracies in the sense that it rules out a real human body or corpse being involved in the image formation process. As I said, let's get back to James, who he claims to provide two arguments as to why the dating of the shroud is in fact relevant. So let's go back to that. Let's again assume, let's pretend for the sake of argument the shroud is medieval. And now James is saying, and I can prove that's relevant to the question of the image formation mechanism and ruling out a more supernatural, miraculous explanation because of these two reasons. So let's hear what James has to say there.
Anyway, I can I respond to your question before, Dale, about the dating? Because I think I don't think we're making any progress here. So you asked me why it's relevant that the shroud dates to the 14th century. So I think I did answer this because there's a couple of reasons. One is that if my hypothesis is that the shroud was produced by a medieval artist, then it should date to that period, right? The medieval artist hypothesis is not motivated by the carbon dating directly. It certainly precedes that. It's motivated by the techniques, like the stylistic aspects that I talked about, as well as the textual evidence. The fact that it carbon dates that period is independent evidence that's using an established, well-known, well-validated technique that strongly supports the hypothesis that it was made by a medieval artist around that time. Now, let's contrast that with the supernatural miracle explanation. As I've said, one of the problems with supernatural explanations is that they're, certainly with respect to God, is they're completely unconstrained because God's omnipotent. He can do anything. So of course God could make a miraculous shroud that carbon dates to the Middle Ages. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying it's relevant is because why would God make a miracle, that a miraculous object that carbon dates to the Middle Ages? It seems like God is just being deliberately confusing here, that he's making an artifact that is supposed to vindicate the miraculous resurrection of Jesus, but then when scientists test it, it looks like it was made in the Middle Ages. Why is God being so confusing? So that's why the two reasons why I think that the dating is relevant.
As I said, James doesn't accept this, and he says, no, I have two good reasons as to why the dating is relevant to the question of whether the shroud images are miraculously formed or not, and versus an artistic image. And the first is that, under the medieval artist hypothesis would predict that we would get these medieval results, and therefore it fits with the medieval milieu. Yeah, of course, but the medieval miracle also equally explains that. Though all those same features, the carbon-14 dating, it would explain why the medieval artists are, the medieval artists are copying the Shroud of Turin, which was formed in the medieval period, and or the god is copying the artist to make a medieval image that would be accepted by the medieval contemporaries as being authentic. And therefore they would preserve it as opposed to having it destroyed, like literally every other shroud in history is now destroyed. We don't have any of these medieval shrouds that you shroud skeptics like to speak of and pretend are plentiful out there that are supposedly had images of Jesus on it. So I just think this doesn't favor your hypothesis at all. As for the Darcy memo, again, you're just assuming this is good evidence and not proven garbage and rubbish. You're assuming there are no earlier than medieval references to the shroud to make this work. You're just asserting your opinion. You're not giving any proof or evidence, and in fact, it's you that's ignoring evidence, all the evidence proving the shroud dates centuries prior to the medieval period, to make your argument work here. So it fits the medieval milieu, works if you assume and assert your skeptical assumptions and positions regarding the Darcy memo, regarding art history and that sort of thing. But like I said, even if it is medieval, the medieval miracle hypothesis fits all of the data as well. It can be made to explain the Darcy memorandum. Of course, if a medieval miracle popped into existence and we had a jealous, greedy bishop over in Troy who didn't like seeing a bunch of pilgrims go to the Leary church, give their money to the Leary church. He wanted the money greedily for himself. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. If it did a medieval miracle to another church and that church is getting money or not, you're going to lie. You're going to make up stuff and say, this is a fake, this is a fraud. Makes perfect sense and is equally explained on the medieval miracle hypothesis. Again, same with it fitting artistic things. God would make it do that so that the medieval people would accept it as relevant. And or the medieval paintings were copied from the Shroud of Turin, as a lot of James's examples are known copies from the Shroud of Turin. You know, he quotes things from the 1400s and Renaissance period. That's not the medieval period, the Renaissance period in the 1400s, where they're copying the shroud and stuff like that, or up to the Shroud of Besancon. These are all known copies of the shroud, not the other way around. So that fits the medieval miracle hypothesis as well, either way that you look at it. And the carbon-14 dating, perfect fit, because it's a medieval. Yeah, I would expect a carbon date to the medieval period. So this example doesn't prove your case at all. It's equally probable on both hypotheses. We are back at the principle of indifference. Maybe it's a medieval miracle, maybe it's not. And that's where James presents his second reason, which I think is better. This is actually one of the reasons I include out of the 7 to 8 reasons I've heard from Shroud skeptics trying to prove that dating is relevant, namely that it turns God into a deceiver. And I think we covered that in the debate sufficiently, so I don't need to get into it again. Great question from Juan of Modern Atheism. And actually, again, it's not just to authenticate the religion. It's also meant to providentially, from a Christian context, save as many souls as possible, or have as many free creatures freely choose to achieve their ultimate purpose in creation as possible. And providentially, only an omniscient God would know, given the butterfly effect, how everything would work together providentially to either achieve that goal or not. And therefore, God would know, yes, producing a image shroud with precisely these properties is what is necessary to attain that end goal. Prove that wrong, Jake. Prove that's improbable. James can't do it. He's got nothing. He's a finite human being. All he can do is just kind of mocked a little bit and said, well, of course you have to say that on the pro-shroud side. Sure, yes, but likewise you have to deny that on the Shroud skeptical side. Then you can't claim that God is being deceitful because he knew he's doing what he has to do to accomplish his end goal and save as many souls as possible. Plus, there's the fact that it's not like God is producing these images saying, hey, I covered the corpse of Jesus. I'm the actual burial shroud of Jesus dated to 30 AD. Show me the label on the shroud that says that. Nothing images contains that propositional content. It is just assumed by the medievals that that's what it is. On the medieval miracle hypothesis, false assumptions on the part of the medievals. That's their fault and their problem. Just like any of us human beings when we make a hasty assumption and go beyond what the data itself says. So yeah, there's no proof that God is deceitful, even if it's a medieval miracle. You've been defeated, therefore we're back at the principle of indifference. A medieval miracle hypothesis is equally explainable to a medieval artistic explanation. The dating is irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether it's medieval. So when it comes to the Shroud of religion authenticating miraculous criteria, I'm not excluding any evidence at all. I'm simply categorizing the evidence properly into relevant or irrelevant categories. Relevant or irrelevant with respect to what? With respect to the fundamental hypothesis that the image formation is constitutes a religion authenticating miracle or is an instance of divine design. And I argue my criteria are sufficient to get to the conclusion that it's divine design. And I said, number one, the skeptic can provide us with no reason to think that it is relevant with respect to that question. Second, I provided my own reason that I think is extremely persuasive and proves the point. Everyone agrees, including skeptics on James's own blog. They mock and laugh like fools, ignorant, arrogant fools, laughing at me, their intellectual superior and epistemic superior. But they admit, in one skeptic, I remember I saw his comment where he's like, yeah, a talking Lego Jesus. Okay, I'd believe in that. Now show me a shroud that talks. And he laughs out of sheer stupidity. Meanwhile, he just proved my point that dating is irrelevant, the anatomical accuracy is irrelevant. That was the purpose of the analogy. The analogy was not to say, oh, the evidence that a miracle has taken place is the same quality as we have with the Lego Jesus versus the Shroud of Turin. No, in my example, the evidence for the miraculousness or extraordinariness of the Lego Jesus example is better than what we have with the Shroud of Turin. It's better, but both are sufficient, and that who cares? I don't care that the Lego Jesus is stronger proof of a miracle because, hey, you've got a walking, talking Lego Jesus on a photo. Yeah, I admit it would be if we had a walking, talking Jesus on the Shroud of Turin, images on the Shroud of Turin, that would be even stronger evidence. That would be very obvious but that wasn't the point of my using the Lego Jesus analogy. My point is that it doesn't matter when these walking, talking Jesuses is, so long as the evidence for a miracle is sufficient, you don't care about the date of it. You don't care. It has no connection with the historical Jesus in 30 AD when the actual resurrection happened. No, this 2011 picture that has anatomical inaccuracies and historical inaccuracies galore, but God went poof, and it now has miraculous properties, walking, talking images from 2011 of Lego Jesus authenticating, yes, in 30 AD, Jesus, the real Jesus who I represent really was crucified. He really did die and rise from the dead. And that alone is good enough. That's my point. Yeah, there's nothing ridiculous about my point, as some of the skeptical commentators were laughing at me and mocking me and stuff. Actually, I was quite brilliant. You as a skeptic just confirmed, yep, you would believe in Lego Jesus despite the fact that, and believe that Lego Jesus confirmed is a religion authenticating miracle. Jesus died, rose from the dead. I better be a dang Christian. You admitted you would do that regardless of the fact that those photos, miraculous images, only date to 2011. They contain anatomical inaccuracies. They contain historical inaccuracies and that sort of thing. Those are side issues to you. And you as a skeptic admitted that when you said, haha, yeah, sure, I would believe in the Lego Jesus, but the shroud isn't the same quality of evidence as a walking, talking Lego Jesus, is he? No one claimed it was. The shroud evidence is not as convincing or persuasive. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't matter because so long as it's sufficiently demonstrated to be a religion authenticating miracle, that's all you need. It's more probable than not this is a religion authenticating miracle. Then that's all that establishes the point.
Okay, so just before we get to James's next objection, just something I wanted to add here. A couple of quick points about God being a deceiver and skeptics being inconsistent with each other. So a couple of skeptics in James' audience were saying, well, look, the Lego example, even if I accept that, there is a telling and relevant disanalogy. The Shroud of Turin is clearly meant to be a burial shroud, so the reasonable person would reasonably infer that it was Jesus' burial shroud, and because that's what it looks like it's meant to be portraying. Whereas the Lego Jesus is clearly meant to be a Lego Jesus, not historically associated with Christ. Now, what do I say to that? So, twofold. First response is the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey, agreed with me on the show, and perhaps I'll play a clip of him, where he agreed, well, what if it is meant to portray the burial shroud of Jesus Christ, and it's actually a medieval miraculous copy of Jesus' actual burial shroud, or perhaps a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of the Jesus burial shroud. As though God is using a miraculous photocopy of Jesus' burial shroud, because Jesus' original burial shroud over time got shredded and became no good. So so God renews it, makes a medieval miraculous copy of Jesus' burial shroud with those remarkable shroud images. The ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey, said, you're an utter fool if you disagree with me and say that that's unreasonable, that's improbable. No, that's equally likely.
In this case, I'm
interested in the miracles that God uses as signs to authenticate Christianity. So that's a specific subset of miracles here. So if it's a stronger thing, it's got to be an extraordinary event or a, very improbable given our current understanding of laws of physics and stuff like that. And it's specified for the purpose of authenticating Christianity. If the shroud were proved medieval, do you think it would falsify that understanding rather than more the loosey?
Well, no, exactly. Well, that's precisely my point. I don't think it would. No, I think the effect that it's had is enough, really. Funnily enough, but I was just yesterday or the day before, I was reading something about the shroud copies in Spain. Is it Sabregas? There's a famous shroud copy there, and there's a legend that whether that particular the person who painted it or two of his friends went along and they tried to copy the shroud, and they couldn't. They gave it up and they went home and spent the night. And the next day they went back to collect their material, and the shroud had copied itself onto their cloths. And the shroud of Sabregas and some of the other Spanish copies are just are the results of that. So that other shrouds are considered medieval in the exact sense that you would like it to be considered, as a work of out beyond the workings of scientific knowledge.
Gotcha. Yeah. So if that were true, we could establish that the shroud somehow miraculously copied itself in the medieval period. You're absolutely right. That would qualify. Okay.
So a second objection, again, comes from the ultimate shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey. And remember, you skeptics love to claim that, well, the cloth of the Shroud of Turin is totally inconsistent with a first century burial shroud. In point of fact, it's totally inconsistent with a medieval burial shroud. The cloth is not a burial shroud. No one ever claimed that. If you're on the regular pro-shroud side like myself, you believe it did cover the historical Jesus and was used as his burial shroud, but nobody says that the cloth itself is a regular first century burial shroud. No, as the world's expert Ada Grossi says, no, this was probably a temple cloth used in the service of the temple. Very rich, very unique and wealthy. And it had a defect in it. We can see a strip was taken off and had to be re-sewn on back by the manufacturer. So it was impure and couldn't be used by the temple. So it was discarded. And that's where the rich Joseph of ancient Arimathea, in his haste to bury Jesus because it was such a rush, 3 p.m., he's dead. Oh my gosh, we've only got 3 hours to get this guy buried before the Sabbath, before the Passover and all of that. So in his rush, he buys the cloth from the temple and uses that as a burial shroud, which Jewish tradition perfectly allows us to use. In extenuating circumstances, you were allowed to use anything as a burial shroud almost, especially a discarded temple cloth. Not a problem at all. Most people were buried in their own little clothing or cloaks. They were so poor they couldn't afford a burial shroud proper. In the ancient Roman world, this is not everyone. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the world living in the medieval period would have known this is not a burial shroud. Therefore, they wouldn't have connected it to the burial shroud of Jesus as a reasonable person. And it gets even worse for you shroud skeptics, because the ultimate shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey, he's gone further than James or anybody else, and he actually gets into the questions of why, when, where, and how the shroud was actually made. James doesn't answer those questions with any specificity. So his explanation is very weak and a failed hypothesis. At least Hugh goes, well, who made it? Well, in around 1290, maybe between 1290 and 1320, rich cathedral commissioned the Shroud of Turin images to be created as part of the Quem Queritas ritual. In other words, they took a long altar cloth or tablecloth, very long, which is what the shroud cloth looks like, and they used that to create these remarkable images. Over time, for one reason or another, they decided to get rid of it and give it to the Dean of Leary. Now, here's the problem. If this if this resembles, according to Shroud Skeptics, a medieval table or altar cloth, that would mean every medieval Tom, Dick, and Harry in the world would know. There were apparently hundreds of these throughout Europe, celebrated at the Quem Queritas ritual every year at Easter time. Every medieval Tom, Dick, and Harry in the world, if they were reasonable, would know, hey, you're telling me this is the burial shroud of Jesus? It can't be. This is the same Quem Queritas altar cloth or the tablecloth we see every year at Easter. There's nothing. This isn't the burial shroud of Jesus. Everyone would have known it if they were reasonable. But the medievals were behaving unreasonably, and in their piety and eagerness and gullibility to believe, they just believed the authority. Oh, the authority says it's the burial shroud of Jesus, so I believe that, and I want to go see it. But you can see these 2 points undermine. In the first place, the ultimate Shroud skeptic Hugh Farey agrees with me that only a fool could deny that God could create a medieval miraculous copy of Jesus' burial shroud. Maybe that's what we're looking at. Secondly, every reasonable medieval person in the world would have not concluded that this was Jesus' burial shroud, because they would have known, well, the cloth is not a shroud. It's actually the Quem Queritas altar cloth that we see every year. But nonetheless, even if it is the altar cloth, it looks like God zapped miraculous images of Jesus at the moment of his death onto it, thereby implying his resurrection. Incredible. His death and resurrection on the cross. So, yeah, that's what we had. I just wanted to add in those notes, coming from Shroud skeptics, backing up my notion of the medieval miracle hypothesis here for the Shroud of Turin's images, and they're not provable deceptions on God's part at all. All right, let's move on to James's next objection.
Another problem with these criteria is that there is no attempt to show that the shroud can be explained better by supernatural processes. So Dale does not attempt at all. He did mention briefly, but he also said that he's not going to present it in the presentation, and he didn't explain it. So he didn't attempt to articulate what a supernatural process would be for forming the shroud. Saying that the shroud could be produced by a basic divine action doesn't actually explain the shroud. Remember what a good explanation for the shroud should be. It should explain the when, the what, the how, and the why. So plausibly, the divine basic action only explains the how. It doesn't explain any of the other things. It doesn't explain why the shroud dates to the Middle Ages, or why it only has documentary evidence to the Middle Ages. It doesn't explain why it has the artistic features that I outlined. It doesn't explain why God would make a shroud that has these properties, which we'll get to in a moment, which in many ways are quite misleading to a potential believer. So the point is just saying God did it. It doesn't actually explain any of the relevant features of the shroud. What we should be trying to do is compare the explanatory virtues of what I'm the particular naturalistic hypothesis that I'm outlining based on the Gala-Shelley technique and the medieval dating against whatever it is that Dale would articulate as his vision for how and why the shroud came to be. God did it. It doesn't explain anything. It simply says that there is a divine origin, but without actually being able to draw any explanatory inferences that accounts for the specific features.
Okay, so this critique seems... So in a sense, it's true, and I purposefully was vague, right? So my explanation of a basic action on God's part is only meant to answer the question of how. It also answers the question of who, obviously, right? And how they did it. It was a basic action. There are no intervening mechanisms. There are no natural mechanisms. It was just a supernatural basic action on God's part, and that's a perfect explanation for why this event exists. You don't need any more. It's a full causal explanation of how this event, the formation of the shrouded images, came to be, and explains their features, the specific features they have. Now, I'm not accounting for why God did it this way or made these images. Apart from, the context we do get at least a partial explanation of why, right? It is to authenticate the religion of Christianity, Jesus' death and resurrection, and therefore it entails that the truth of Christianity, and or at the very least, God endorses Christianity. It's the one humans should follow to achieve their ultimate purpose in creation. We get answers, and these are good enough, right? Now, he's right that I never made an attempt to compare. In my opening case, I never made an attempt to compare, except for the fact that I did apply explanatory power and scope, right? So I said that any and all artistic mechanisms, which is all James is positing, right? So the debate here is supernatural versus artistic. There is no other naturalistic theories in consideration for the purposes of this debate. So, and I showed my criteria do show any and all artistic explanations fail to fulfill the minimal relevant features. And therefore the claim is, yes, supernatural, God did it, is better. God did it explains every necessary feature, minimal relevant feature of the Shroud's images, therefore explains the images. It explains why the Shroud of Turin is superficial only on 2 to 4 things, whereas your method doesn't explain that. It can't explain that, and therefore is not an explanation for it. It lacks explanatory scope. It lacks explanatory power on several features. In the debate itself, we covered the three-dimensionality and the vertical mapping. Yes, the Shroud of Turin, okay, artistic, the God did it explanation has full explanatory scope and power because it explains the three-dimensional properties of the shroud that we have. It explains the, whereas by contrast, your artistic mechanisms, okay, maybe let's grant them explanatory scope because it does contain some 3D info. It can account for the 3D, but not to the same degree or quality as the shroud. It lacks explanatory power. It takes some twisting in the skeptic's mind to make it fit, right? Oh, well, there's variations of techniques. So maybe this time we got 40 fibers thick, which Hugh Farey lied. I referred to his experiment, not Luigi Galliscelli. And same with the three-dimensionality. It lacks explanatory power. It can contain some 3D info, but not all the 3D info. If you're going to explain something, you have to explain every property of that shroud, or at the very least be capable of it. And pointing out experimental variation does not get you off the hook because it doesn't matter how many experiments you do. We've done dozens of the artistic techniques James proposes. They fail every time. They're incapable of ever creating images that are 2 to 4 fibers thick. And that's proven now on a balance of probability based on our theoretical knowledge of the process. It's just the laws of physics are not going to allow that. Sorry. It's just obvious based on the laws of physics and an understanding. And this has been backed up in all practical experimental data from the dozens of experiments done where they variate the procedures and specifically take efforts like Hugh Farey's scrub-a-dub-dubbing and washing this thing to get everything out. And same, Luigi Galliscelli did the same. He did everything to account for any of the variable factors. It doesn't matter that you can wait 700 years or 1,000 years. It's not going to make a difference. You're never going to get it 2 to 4 fibers thick. You can perform all the experiments you want. Perform the experiment in a pink tutu. It's not going to make a difference. This method has been proven theoretically from the laws of physics and experimentally based on our practical knowledge. They cannot explain this feature. So you lack explanatory power, and you can't explain it to the same degrees in terms of three-dimensionality. So a lack of explanatory power, a lack of explanatory scope. This is how we tell which explanations are better than others. The divine hypothesis gets checks on everything. The only possible question is plausibility, but you didn't bring up the prior probability issue in this debate. So full check mark for plausibility. Same deal with on the other end. It lacks explanatory power, lacks explanatory. I also made the case that your artistic mechanisms lack plausibility. We can make an inference to the best explanation. We don't have to explain what you say. Your arbitrary criteria of explaining why, how, where, give me all these precise details. While those are nice, I'm glad you made an attempt to answer them, but you didn't actually answer them properly. They're not necessary to answer. Who cares why? We don't have to have an answer as to why in order to infer that an intelligent designer like God or a human being made something. I mean, can you tell me, answer why, without speculating, tell me and prove why the medieval artist made the shroud? You just make stuff, oh, it's devotion or it's to fraud people. Prove it. Which one was it, first of all, and prove which one it was. You haven't answered something just by saying, well, there's potential motivations. Okay, well, I gave potential motivations for God, right? To authenticate the religion and to save as many free will creatures as possible, and you dismiss those. But those are an answer to the question of why. Not that I need to answer that necessarily. So long as it's better plausibility, better explanatory scope, better explanatory power compared to any and all artistic mechanisms, that's all I need. I win right there. And that compares the two hypotheses. All right, let's move on.
A final problem with the criteria that Dale's advocated is that there's no allowance here for unknown natural processes. In fact, it would seem to me that every single unknown process that an ordinary person, if an ordinary person looks up at the sky and hears and sees thunder, and they don't understand about the electrical processes that go into making that, and that they view that thunder and hear it in a context of following a religious event, or even just when they prayed or were thinking about something, that to them would seem to satisfy the RAM criteria. Not just in previous times, but even in the present time, because an ordinary person may not know about the mechanisms that give rise to thunder, lightning, or any other religious icon, or literally anything that ever happens ever.
So this is absolutely true, and that's by design. At first, I was thinking that a reasonable person would be obligated to consider natural anomalies or, okay, well, maybe there's some kind of thing I don't know about today, but I'll find out about that explains this. And in the end, I decided the reasonable real seeker or the reasonable person would not be obligated for this, because that would be God's obligation. Those factors don't need to be considered. That's irrelevant. God will not bind us to a perpetual state of skepticism, of playing what-if games. Oh, shoot, what if there's just something I don't know about that will explain this? We don't have to be in a perpetual state of skepticism. We make conclusions based on the knowledge we are privy to, and we can be rest assured in that based on God, at least when it comes to these things where we would expect God to be involved in fixing our cognitive faculties.
At least, if not fixing the cognitive faculties, mitigating for them, mitigating for their deficiencies due to the cognitive effects of sin.
Otherwise, we become this naturalism of the gaps. Like this is really what James is doing. He's trying to argue and make it impossible to ever include there would be a supernatural miracle or a religion authenticating miracle. I mean, we could ask James, under what criteria, what are the minimal necessary set of criteria which are sufficient for concluding that a religion authenticating miracle has taken place, that God actually has done something? I guarantee you James has never thought deeply about that question. He wouldn't have something like this. Like I've put thought into what the minimal necessary criteria and sufficient criteria would be for concluding this. I don't think James would be, and I've not met a single skeptic who's able to answer that question in any kind of depth or rigor like I have with my criteria. So you don't need to care about, what I may know tomorrow. When that day comes, you worry about those. As the Bible tells us, let the cares for tomorrow worry about themselves. I'm here today, and that's enough. That's sufficient. And I base my decisions based on what I know. I don't have to be the perpetual skeptic based on, well, what if? Let me play the game of what if there's, there's a giant pink tutu out there, and that's what caused the shroud. There's a giant floating celestial teapot out there. Otherwise you turn into a ridiculous fool like Matt Dillahunty when he says, well, Mike Lacona gives the example, well, what if my head were cut off right in front of you, and then miraculously it comes back, and I'm right in front of your own very eyes. Matt Dillahunty starts with, maybe there's some kind of natural anomaly because you have lizard DNA or something. How ridiculous. This is skepticism to the point of foolishness. And that's what James is trying to argue for. Basically makes it impossible to ever rationally include that a miracle has taken place. He's being hypocritical here. He is guilty of this, not me. And again, I put to you, James, I want to know, what are your list of minimal necessary and sufficient conditions for concluding that a religion authenticating miracle has happened? At what point would you go, yeah, God did do that?
All right, that's all I wanted to cover here. He goes on in his rebuttal to apply to the Shroud of Turin and that sort of thing, and I'll leave that there as to what was said during the debate. Obviously, I have more answers for that, but in this case, I just it was important to me to go over the general critique of my religion authenticating miracle criteria in general. So, all right, That's it for part 1. Look out for part 2, where I'm going to be responding to a blog from the ultimate Shroud Skeptic, Hugh Farey, and responding to some of the skeptics and commentators in the YouTube videos of James Fodor and Tavo San Abri, some by good skeptics in the live chat, Kevin Nontradicath, for example, others not so good skeptics who are going to be, who need a little education, let's say. All right, tune in for that in the next couple weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. All right, bye-bye.